Chapter 61. Negative reactions to news of biosphere collapse are not uncommon. Grief, sorrow, anger, panic, shame, guilt, dissociation, and depression are frequently seen responses to news of global climate catastrophe. These negative reactions can sometimes become extreme enough to be labeled pathological. One pathological reaction, a form of avoidance, has been called the Mask of the Red Death syndrome, after the story by Edgar Allan Poe. In the story, a group of privileged aristocrats, isolated in a castle on a peak above a countryside devastated by a plague, stage a masquerade to distract themselves or to display indifference or defiance to their eventual fate. They arrange the rooms of the castle such that each room is illuminated by light stained a different color, and then, having dressed themselves in costumes including masks and dominoes, they parade through the castle dancing to music, eating extravagant meals, and so forth. A silent masked stranger then appears and stalks through the party, and few readers are surprised when this stranger turns out to be death itself. The syndrome is thus an assertion that the end being imminent and inevitable, there is nothing left to do except party while you can. The late Middle Ages Dance of Death, Danse Macabre in French, Totentanz in German, is an earlier example of this response, in this case associated with the Black Death. It is likely to have been one of Poe's inspirations. Even more extreme pathological responses to biosphere collapse are possible and have been observed. Some who feel the end is near work to hasten it, or worsen it. Their position seems to be that if they're going to die, then the world must die with them. This is clearly a manifestation of narcissism and has been named the Götterdämmerung syndrome. Hitler, in the last days of World War II, has become the canonical example of this response. Hatred of the other is also quite obviously manifested in such a reaction. The name for this response comes from Wagner's opera Götterdämmerung, which ends with the old gods of the pre-Christian Norse mythology destroying the world as they die, in a final murderous and suicidal auto-da-fe. A folk translation of this word into English has it as the god-damning of the world, although this makes use of a false cognate and the German actually means the twilight of the gods, and is Wagner's German neologism for the Norse word Ragnarok. The Götterdämmerung syndrome, as with most violent pathologies, is more often seen in men than women. It is often interpreted as an example of narcissistic rage. Those who feel it are usually privileged and entitled, and they become extremely angry when their privileges and sense of entitlement are being taken away. If then their choice gets reduced to admitting they are in error or destroying the world, a reduction they often feel to be the case, the obvious choice for them is to destroy the world, for they cannot admit they have ever erred. Narcissism is generally regarded as the result of a stunted imagination and a form of fear. For the narcissist, the other is too fearful to register, and thus the individual death of the narcissist represents the end of everything real. As a result, death for the narcissist becomes even more fearful and disastrous than it is for people who accept the reality of the other and the continuance of the world beyond their individual end. Even the night sky frightens the narcissist, as presenting impossible to deny evidence of a world exterior to the self. Narcissists therefore tend to stay indoors, live in ideas, and demand compliance and assent from everyone they come in contact with, who are all regarded as servants or ghosts. And as death approaches, they do their best to destroy as much of the world as they can. The phrase Götterdämmerung capitalism has been seen. This marks a shift, possibly inappropriate, from psychology to sociology, and is therefore outside the purview of this article, and is in any case self-explanatory. Chapter 62. Sibylla Schmidt, Officer in Charge. We took subject Mary Murphy under protection 7 a.m. June 27th. My team for this mission: Thomas, Jurg, Priskami. Priska did her best to make M feel comfortable, and was clearly not happy. Her ministry was thought by some in the intelligence division to have been involved with the hijacking of Davos, so Jurg suggested to Thomas that she shouldn't be so picky now. Of course, he was professionally polite, and did not say this around her. I told him to keep such thoughts to himself from now on. We're a good team, rated best in the Swiss Federal Secret Service's internal evaluations. Of course, our branch came in for heavy criticism after the Davos incident, and many people felt we must have been involved in that somehow, that we were complicit in it, or allowed it to go on longer than it should have. Always an obvious pleasure in criticizing us, especially when coming from the political figures we protect. The Spaspalizii, they call us the killjoys, but they don't usually reject our services when required. Switzerland is a very free and safe place compared to most. Old European joke. In heaven the cooks are French, the police British, the engineers German, the lovers Italian, while in hell the cooks are British, the police German, the engineers Italian. The Swiss are in the joke somehow too, but I forget as what. Maybe the same job in both heaven and hell? Schedulers? Bankers? Security force? I can't remember. Maybe it's a Swiss joke. We moved in one of our vans, bulletproofed, road bomb-resistant, darkened windows, secure comms. Priska and Thomas made perfunctory compliments on how light traveled. We put her in back with Priska. The rest of us sat in the middle seat and up front. Jurg drove. Highway to Bern, no incidents. Bern to Thun, then up the western shore of the Thunersee. Up twists and turns into Heidi Land, big wooden houses lined with red geraniums, green Alps rising to the dark cliffs of the Berner Oberland. I prefer Graubünden. In Kandersteg we left the highway and took the track up to the Eskenensee, using their private service road beyond the upper cable car terminal. On the way Priska explained to why Kandersteg was a backwater, pointing around us. Basically because of no skiing, simply because all the town's surrounding slopes are cliffs. Only way out of the Box Canyon is through the old train tunnel to the Rhone, one of the oldest tunnels of all. So it's quiet, like all the alpine canyons too steep to ski. There are far fewer paragliders than skiers. Drove by sheep on an Alp and said it looks like Ireland if you don't look up. Ridge to south very tall. Arrived at the Eskenensee, 10:40 a.m. Substantial round lake under tall cliff, a curving wall of gray granite at least 1,000 meters high, all in a single leap up from the lake. Very dramatic. Lake an opaque blue, sign of glaciers somewhere overhead. Priska told about the Eskenensee, explained to her that it was rare to have a lake this big this high, because all the alpine valleys had been so smoothed by the giant glaciers of the Ice Age that no ribs of rock remained to hold water. So no ponds or lakes until you got down to the giants of the Midland. But here a landslide had fallen off the cliff overhanging the valley, creating a blockage that eventually filled with a natural reservoir of melted snow. The lake has no outlet stream, Priska said, because its water seeps through the landslide and comes out in a big spring partway down to Kandersteg. I didn't know about this either and found it interesting, but just nodded, too distracted to be interested. We drove by the Mountain Hotel on the lakeshore to its second building, reserved for us. Family owners aware of our situation, helping as they have before. One of the SAC huts above the lake was being cleared for our use, without a fuss, so that it would take a couple of days. So now we stayed in the Lakeside Hotel's second building. 2 days were spent walking around the lake with them. She refused to stay in building, and I felt the walks were secure enough, confirmed that with Bern. Paths around the lake partly forested, rising into Alps above treeline. Always paused to inspect the wooden statues in forest, carved from tree trunks, not cut down. Primeval figures, beast faces, local folklore, the Bugan, etc., all looming in shadows among trees. Higher up the trail runs through a Krumholz, trees small and gnarled. Typical Berner Oberland, Priska said. As we walked she told about the Alps, mostly things we all know, but Priska knows more. The cliff backing the lake really is very dramatic. Every day scraps of cloud hung partway up the cliff, showing how tall it was. Said the cliff was all by itself taller than the tallest mountain in Ireland. Its height, and the strange pastel cobalt color of the lake, gives the area the look of bad computer imagery or a painted paperback cover, too improbable and fantastic to be real. I definitely prefer Graubünden. Spoke with the hotel's owners one evening. They are now middle-aged. I met them once when they were younger, when my parents brought me here. Now their children are grown enough to run the place. The son will be 5th generation to own and run place, they told She commented on how unusual that was, and they nodded. They felt lucky, they said. They like it here. Asked if one could hike all the way around the lake, gesturing at the cliffs.
Priska shook her head at this.
There's a crux, the son replied, pointing across the lake. It can be done, but there's one ledge, pointing at a green line crossing the cliffs about halfway up. It can be done, he said, but I only did it once and I was young. I wouldn't do it again. There's one spot where it's too narrow for comfort. As so often, Em said. The son nodded, said there's always a crux. Next day we went up to the SAC Fronten hut, now emptied for us. 5:20 a.m. departure. 1,000-meter ascent, hard in places. Em was tired from the start and seemed frustrated we hadn't stayed at Lake. Orders from Byrne, I told her. Standard procedure. The real safe house here is the SAC hut. 6 hours steep uphill walk, always on trail. Cable handholds lining one steep wall section. Em, maybe suffering from altitude. She was slow and quiet. Fronten hut was imposing, a big stone box faced with red and white chevroned window shutters. Strange to see in such high remote location as always with SAC huts. Each more unlikely than the next, it's a game they play to amuse their fellow climbers and hut keepers. This one located on a rise in the bed of a glacier now gone, the remnant ice still hanging on at the top of the basin. An old terminal moraine extends in low curves to each side of the hut. Photos on the hut's dining room wall show the Fronten Gletscher in 1902, a big ice tongue almost reaching the hut, looming over it. Then 4 more photos through the years, 2 aerial, showing ice recession. Now, just a scrap of grayish-white, pasted up there under the cliff at the low point of the ridge. Em rested that afternoon. I suspected a touch of altitude, and gave her Diamox. Later she made a few phone calls on an encrypted connection we made for her. After that she napped, woke in time for sunset. Strong alpenglow against clear sky, some high clouds to east also pink. Em said she could work by phone and hide here for a while very happily. A good sign. Another good sign was her appetite that night. Cooks did raclette and rosti, salad and bread. Hutkeepers a middle-aged couple, with a pair of young assistants. They led Em to a dorm room, all they had, which meant she had an entire Matratzenlager to herself. She laughed to see that. The single mattress extended down the whole length of the room, with numbers on the long headboard marked for 20 sleepers, a duvet and pillow for each. She took 2 pillows and said goodnight. 9:10 p.m. Next day, hut empty except for us and the hutkeepers. Em breakfasted in dining room, did her email and made calls on encrypted lines provided to her. Then drinking coffee on patio overlooking lake, 1,200 meters below. The Alps are big, she remarked to Priska. Later that day she asked to go for a walk, and we led her up to the foot of the Fronten Gletscher, some 6 kilometers up basin. Less steep than the ascent to hut had been the day before. Priska explained why this was when Mary remarked on it. Instead of going up the side of a big glacial U-valley, as we had yesterday, we were now walking along the bottom of a smaller, higher U-valley. Rock-strewn floor of a hanging valley, much less steep than where it falls into the bigger valley below. Same as always. Less moss and lichen and alpine flowers the higher we ascended, until bare rock, probably under ice until just a few years ago. By mid-afternoon we reached the foot of the glacier, which was mostly covered with black rubble fallen off the ridge, but also cut by white vertical melt incisions, making the glacial ice visible, and, in the deepest parts of cracks, quite blue. It must be depressing, Em remarked. You can really see the glaciers are melting. It's bad, Priska said. Maybe not as bad as the Himalayas, where the melt is their water supply. Still, it changes things here too. We lose some water, some hydropower. And it feels wrong. Like a disease. Some kind of fever, killing our glaciers. Even so, the remaining wall of this glacier's foot stood about 15 meters overhead. Getting onto the glacier proper would involve climbing a lateral moraine, then crossing the gap between moraine and ice. Possibly a job for crampons going up the ice itself, unless a good level bridge of rock or ice were found. Not on this day's program. Hiked with them back down basin, seeing better just how steep our ascent had been. Pleasant evening at hut. We all woke at 2:46 a.m. to a very loud roar and clatter. We rushed to Em, prepared for trouble, Jurg with pistol ready. To windows to look out, but a moonless night, nothing to see. The sound had ended, nothing more to hear or see. Avalanche, Priska suggested. No, rock fall, said one of the hut keepers. Not snow, but rock. Rock for sure, he said. The noise had been so loud. It had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The hut was set on its little rise of rock, well away from the cliffs flanking it, so the hut keeper said we shouldn't be in any trouble from rock fall or the runouts that sometimes happened. Back to bed for most of us, but Jurg and Priska and I stayed up for a while outside M's room, sitting on floor, not sleepy. Thomas and one of the hut keepers went out to have a look around, came back reporting a new mass of rock now lay just west of the hut. We alerted Byrne, wondered what was going on, if we had been attacked. Waited to hear back from Byrne about incident, get their take on possibility that hostiles had located M and sent something her way. At dawn we went out and saw it, a new rock slide, yes. It had come off the steep ridge to the west of the hut. The runout across the basin floor had reached almost to the hut. Immense boulders of schist and gneiss and granite now stood tall on the basin floor. Contact between different kinds of rock was always a weak point, Priska said. The biggest chunks had rolled the farthest in the usual way. One boulder, almost as big as the hut, lay only about 20 meters from it. Looked like a rough statue of the hut itself. It would have crushed the hut if it had run into it with any momentum at all. One more roll of this big dice, in other words, and boom, we would have been crushed. I conferred with my team in Schweizerdeutsch, so M couldn't understand us. This is too much of a coincidence, I told them. I have a bad feeling about this. We are now code red. We moved into that protocol. Byrne agreed. Code red for sure. Get ready to leave, they said. We'll get back to you with an evacuation plan as soon as we have it. Cover must be blown. We considered that. If cover was blown, it would be dangerous to extract by helicopter. Drone attacks were all too possible. Of course, the hut itself vulnerable as well. Byrne said the plan for us would be ready within the hour. Long before that, Priska proposed her own plan. I called Byrne and ran it by them. They took it in, put us on hold, got back to us fast. Do it, they said. We told them. We must leave. Again? She cried. Again. Byrne thinks your location may be somehow known to hostiles. Do you really think someone could trigger a rock slide as big as that? Possibly, yes. The hut keepers say the cliff there had an overhang. Could have fallen naturally, but if the overhang got hit by a missile, maybe not even an explosive missile, just an inert mass hitting at speed, the cliff could have come down. That would bury all signs of a missile and look like an accident. The rock slide could very well have crushed the hut. It just missed. Couldn't have been sure about it until trying it. It couldn't just have been a coincidence? Cliff falling now, after all the centuries of standing there, right when you are here? On that day it falls? It could still be a coincidence, she said. That's what coincidences are. Thomas shook his head. They've seen something in Byrne, he told her. They don't think it's a coincidence. All right, M said, looking more and more disturbed. Where to now? We told her our plan. Chapter 63. They came for her just after midnight, knocking as if to wake her, but she hadn't slept a wink. The whole hut dark and chill, her guardians hushed and nervous. This is when the climbers always leave, Priska told her reassuringly, to get up high before sunlight starts the rock fall. Priska and Sibylla took her into one of the washrooms and ran a wand over her body as she stood shivering in her underwear. Then the wand all over the clothes she was to wear, everything she was going to take along, which was hardly anything. They had asked her to leave her phone at the hut. It would be conveyed to her later on. Same with her clothes. They thought she was clear of tracking devices, they said, but it was best to be sure and leave behind everything not needed for this day. The hut keepers outfitted her with warm clothing, with climbing boots and crampons, and an outerwear suit like a pair of overalls but lined with down. A kind of space suit, it seemed to her. Also a climber's helmet, and a harness to wear around her waist and thighs. I don't think I like this plan, Mary said. It will be all right, Priska said. The front and jock is not that hard. I don't like the sound of that, Mary said. She knew that not that hard, when talking about the Alps, was Swiss speak for fucking hard. And she knew that jock meant pass, meaning probably the low point at the head of their basin, up there above the glacier they had visited the day before. There had been a notch up there in the cliff over the ice, the cliff which was a walled-off section of the crest of the Great Berner Oberland. Once you knew to look for it, the notch was visible even from the hut. But the day before, She had seen that the black rock below the notch had looked completely vertical. Not that hard, right? At 2 a.m., they went out into the frigid night. There was no moon, but illuminated by stars the basin walls glowed, as if with a black interior light of their own. Their headlamps speared the night and illuminated variable circles and ellipses of rough stone ground ahead of them. Mary was roped up between Thomas and Priska, with Sibylla and Jurg on another line beside them. They all had headlamps on their climbing helmets, so no one looked at each other as they spoke. After a couple hours of walking up the stony slope, Mary huffing and puffing and warming up throughout her body, all except for her nose, ears, toes, and fingertips, they came to the foot of the glacier remnant. After that they scrambled up the left lateral moraine, which was composed of loose boulders held poorly in ice-crusted sand. Then Mary had to focus on getting up onto the ice side of the glacier itself. The slope of white ice they were proposing to ascend was tilted at about 45 degrees, maybe more. It was therefore crampin' work, a hard little climb. She had never done anything like it. They sat her down and helped her strap the crampons onto her boots and handed her an ice axe, and after that, when she kicked the ice of the glacier, the front points of her crampons bit into it very nicely. With a good kick it became like standing on the step of a ladder, a step which was really just her stiff-bottomed boot stuck in place. Rather amazing. Up the side of the glacier, she went kick, 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 with the rope extending up from her to Thomas, who was already up on the flatter top of the glacier. It was almost simple. Then she was walking on the glacier's top with the rest of them, and feeling her crampons' downward-pointing points stick into the ice surface, with every step. Sometimes she sank a bit and then stuck, piercing a layer of hard snow. That was firn, Priska told her. Good to walk on. In fact, it was quite strange. Mary found she preferred the bare ice, where she stuck instantly with each step, remaining almost a full crampon tooth's height above it. She had to free her feet with little jerks at each step, then step a little high when moving her feet forward, or she would catch a spike and trip. After she stepped and stuck, she couldn't have slid her foot even if she wanted to. That was reassuring. The boots they had equipped her with were a little too large for her feet, she thought. Sliding around inside the boots was the only give in the whole process. None of this was comfortable for her. It wasn't her kind of thing. She wondered if the whole adventure was even necessary, but didn't want to ask about that, as it would sound like a criticism. And if she was in danger, they were in danger, and yet of course they were sticking with her. It was their job. So she did what they told her to without any commentary of that sort. The fact that they thought this was necessary was quite frightening, actually, if she allowed herself to think about it. Which she didn't. She focused on the ice underfoot, on her breathing. They crunched up the high glacier at a steady pace. The creak and scritch of their crampon straps and points were the only sounds. Once they heard the clatter of a rock falling. Other than that, windless silence. Black sky, filled with stars. Milky Way almost setting in the west, like a noctilucent cloud. Thomas was following a series of flags that flew from wooden sticks set into cans filled to the top with cement. Mary shuddered to think of carrying the cans up here. They had to weigh 20 kilos at least, but now they stayed put and guided the way up to the pass. Priska said they were threading some crevasse fields. They would move the flags when the glacier's ice moved, she said, although that wasn't such a problem on this one, which had melted up to a kind of minimum remnant, an almost stationary ice field. Priska and Sibylla tried to point out some crevasses to her as they passed them, but Mary couldn't see them. Slight depressions in the snow blanketing the ice. Maybe firn rather than ice. She would have walked right over them. A bad idea. Walking by one of the flags, she saw by her headlamp glare that both cans and flags were painted orange. By starlight they were gray. After 2 hours of this ascent, they came to the top of the glacier and faced the black rock of the pass. There was a short and steep-sided gap between the ice of the glacier and the black rock. This gap was the Bergschrund, they told her. Famous for presenting a problem in getting from glaciers onto headwalls, sometimes a terrible problem. Happily, this Bergschrund had a staircase of sorts hacked into the ice side under their feet, its shallow, irregular steps much punctured by crampon tips, leading down to the black rock and ice blocks junking up the bottom of the dark little ravine. Tricky work. Once they got down there, Priska and Thomas actually took her by the hands and watched her footwork with her, and she took their support gratefully. "I'm 58 years old," she wanted to tell them. "This isn't my kind of thing. I'm a city gal." From the bottom of the slash, it was eerie to look up and see just a narrow band of stars overhead. On the rock side of the bergschrund, they climbed by spiking their crampon tips into cracks in the rock. This seemed like a bad idea, but in fact her boots stuck on the rock even more firmly than they had into ice. And the rock wall proved to have setbacks in it, almost regular enough as to have been cut by, and for people, though Priska said they weren't. Then they topped the wall, and were hiking scratchily, as if on tiny stilts, over almost flat slabs of black rock, leading them slightly up between vertical black walls to each side of them. It looked like a roofless hallway, carved by titans. Priska, in full tour guide mode despite or because of the surreal weirdness of it all, told her that joint faults in the rock had allowed the glacier, when it had been so high as to cover this entire section of the ridge, to pluck and shift loose blocks out of this passage, pushing them probably to the south, as they would see shortly. Now the missing fault block made a break in the ridge, the notch they had seen from below, as squared off as if drawn by a plumb line and carpenter's level. Very surreal. Not to mention the thought of an ice sea so high that it had covered this part of the range, and presumably all the rest of the Alps, all except for even higher ridges and peaks. Just another Swiss Alpine pass, Thomas and the others seemed to suggest by their attitudes, but Priska was obviously proud of it. Each pass in the Alps had its own character, she said. Most were well known since the Middle Ages or, perhaps long before, back to the time when people had first come to these mountains thousands of years ago. Like the Ice Man, found emerging from a glacier in a pass to the east of here. He had crossed his pass 5,000 years before. Or failed to cross, Mary thought but did not say. So they walked through the notch of the Frundenjoch. It was like passing through a hallway from one world to another. It only took about 5 minutes. They were just 13 meters short of a 3,000-meter pass, Priska said. People often jumped up to pretend to touch that 3,000-meter height above the oceans. Swiss people, Mary thought. She couldn't have jumped an inch off the ground. When they came to the far end of the notch, dawn was flooding the Alps to the south. The raw yellow of morning. A new world indeed. Alpenglow stained east-facing peaks pink. Slopes facing the other points of the compass were mauve or purple or black. The ice below them was a rich, creamy blue, the sky overhead a clear pale gray, tinged by the yellow light in the air. Peaks extended to the horizon in all directions, and to the south another great range paralleled the one they were crossing. Below them a long sinuous glacier was flanked by black lateral moraines. The Kanderfern, Priska told her. Not bare ice but firn, which gave it its velvety look. A dark turquoise velvet. Very strange to see. Directly below them lay a drop of empty air, then a slightly tilted mass of bare ice, which served as a kind of terrace, making a long run down to the firn much farther below. The last drop at the end of the ice terrace to the firn was invisible to them from their angle, indicating something obviously steep. A cliff. Mary gritted her teeth as she looked down at it. It was a long way down, and she was already tired, her calves and Achilles tendons aching, an exhausted feeling in her muscles everywhere. She said nothing. She followed them, step by step. Down, then down, then down again. They helped her in places. Hiking on rock in crampons was awkward as hell, but it was solid too, in that her boots kept sticking in place, not the worst sensation to have, given what a slip might do. Priska confirmed what she felt in her feet. You could spike right into a crack on purpose, and hold firm in a way that bare boots wouldn't have. That meant the pressure on her ankles was tremendous, and often she found herself right at the edge of her strength, right on the brink of a fall, feet tilted this way, and that in ways she never would have chosen. A couple of times her only recourse was to give way and step down another step, too fast, unconsidered, desperate. Every time that happened her feet stuck in some new crack, an unexpected salvation. Fuck, she said, time after time. Fucking hell. It couldn't last like that. Some step was bound to go wrong. Her heart was pounding, she was sweating, nothing else existed but this steep broken staircase of cracked black rock. After an endless spell of this work, they got to the ice terrace she had seen from the pass above, which now sloped down as far as they could see, then ended in midair. Obviously some kind of cliff out of sight down there, ice or rock. It didn't matter, it was going to be bad, wickedly bad. We wait here, Priska told her. We wait? Mary repeated. For what? Priska said, they are coming here for us. We're going to catch a ride. Thank God, Mary said. Far, far below, where they could see a different glacier surface, on the far side of the Firn, she spotted a teeny line of flags. Now there was enough light to see they were orange. After 15 or 20 minutes, they heard a thwacking from down the valley. Up to them rose a helicopter, with a Swiss white cross on red painted on its side. It took a while to get up to them. It really was a long way down. And the air was thin. She could feel that right in her bones, a weakness she didn't like to feel. The helicopter landed loudly, and with a great rushing of air, some 50 meters away, on an almost flat stretch of ice. With its rotors still blurring over it in a roar, a helmeted and flight-suited person opened a door in its side and got down and gestured them over to the craft. They ducked and cramponed over to the helo, sat down on the ice and unstrapped their crampons. The others unhooked Mary's for her, then climbed up metal steps into the cabin of the thing. Here it was just as loud as outside, but after they sat down in the big central chamber and were strapped into their webbing seats by a crew member and got their climbing helmets off, they were given earmuff headsets. With those on, the world became very much quieter, and there were voices in her ears. The discussion over the headset was in Swiss German, so Mary just relaxed and flexed her calves and feet. Right on the verge of cramping, they were in several different places. Thighs, too. She was thrashed and no denying it. They had put her next to a little window, and as the helicopter rose, she looked out. Steep black mountains, vast swathes of white snow. Then out over an even deeper valley, immensely bigger, mostly green-walled, and floored by a river and freeways, train tracks, miniature villages with church steeples and square towers and rooftops, and vineyards rising in rows contouring the sides of the great valley walls, especially the south-facing side to their right. The Rhone River, Mary assumed. If she was right, this was the Valais, one of the biggest valleys in Switzerland. Down this immense canyon they flew, lower than the mountains to left and right. Then they turned left, southward, and flew up a narrow valley. Mary knew that the Matterhorn stood at the top of one of these southerly valleys, but she couldn't imagine they would go to Zermatt to hide, and it seemed to her they had flown farther west than that anyway. In the brilliant horizontal morning light, these side valleys were still dark in shadow. She lost her sense of where they were. Eventually the narrow canyon they were sending closed on them, and the helicopter descended onto a concrete pad underneath a concrete dam, a dam very tall and very narrow, incurved like dams often were. A surreal sight, a comic book dam it seemed, exaggerated to caricature. They got out of the helo, went into a building by the landing pad. Here they sat and ate a quick meal, went to the bathroom, changed out of the snow boots and into more conventional hiking boots. Not done walking yet, Priska explained. Another short walk. How short? Mary said, annoyed and fearful. She was tapped out. She could feel that in her legs. 6 kilometers, Priska said. Not so far. And 200 meters up, Thomas added, as if correcting Priska. Full disclosure kind of thing. Mary bit her tongue and said nothing. She was wasted. This was going to be bad. They left the building. By now it was late morning. The sun stood just over the top of the dam, hanging over them. It was the tallest dam in Switzerland, they told her, the 5th tallest on Earth. Nearly 300 meters tall. Happily a cable car was strung up the slope to the west of the dam. They got in a car and rose swiftly, getting an excellent view of the concrete incurve of the dam. Ear-poppingly tall. Hard to imagine someone saying, let's put a dam here. Let's fill the air of this deep, narrow valley with a concrete wall 1,000 feet high. At the upper station of the cable car they got out and walked through a long tunnel, a tunnel with open gallery sections on its left side that gave views down onto the reservoir behind the dam. Water the color of radiator antifreeze. Then they were out of the tunnel and in a high shallow valley, headed west. Another narrow glacial valley, with a trail that ran up its floor next to a chuckling brook. Mary tromped up this trail wearily. It was a lot easier than hiking in crampons and snow boots, she had to admit, but she was out of gas. knackered. It was a little embarrassing that her guards didn't even seem to register it as effortful. Fucking Swiss and their fucking mountains. She had been out-skied by 3-year-olds who weren't even using ski poles, zipping by her not even seeing her. Why should she be surprised now? They were like the ibexes up here. Home ground. Rocky, dusty trail. Green, grassy slopes bordering the creek, rocky walls above the grass. High on the left, low on the right. Up and up again. Grinding. She felt weak in her bones. Then she noticed that the creek to her right was a dark brown color. Its clear water riffled quickly over a reddish-brown streambed. She looked closer. The creek was floored almost entirely by rusty nails. Nails, bolts, washers, nuts, L-joints, other bits of small metal hardware. All of it a dark, rich, rusty brown, carpeting the creek bottom in a dense tangle, like mussels or sea urchins. It was like a vision in a dream, surreal such that she could scarce believe her eyes. She actually wondered if in her exhaustion she was seeing things. "What the hell's that?" she asked her minders, pointing. They shrugged. "From the old days," Priska said. "What old days?" "You will see." Then they topped a rise and found themselves in a round, high basin, a mountain wall to their left, green alp to their right. Grass covered the floor of the basin, along with rocks of all size, from small to house-sized, the big ones like dolmens in Ireland. And then she saw that some of these really were buildings, blank-walled cubes of concrete, doorless and featureless. Then, as she looked around again, Mary saw that the cliff that walled off the basin to the south had inlaid into it 3 massive concrete doors, giant ovals perhaps 15 or 20 meters high, and almost as wide. Like the blockhouses on the basin floor, these walls in the cliff were as blank as concrete could be. "What is this?" Mary asked. "Military," Sibylla told her curtly. "Air Force," Priska added, gesturing at the giant doors in the cliff, as if that explained what she meant. "Civilians not actually allowed in this basin," they told her. "No one comes here." "But we did," Mary said. And then a small concrete door under the giant ones, so small Mary had not noticed it, opened from the inside. Her minders led her up and into it. She followed them right into the mountain. One of the Swiss Air Force's secret bases, she gathered. Priska had gone uncharacteristically silent. Mary had heard rumors about these places, everyone had. A rocket-launched jet facility, remnant of the Cold War, designed to repel Soviet invasion. If the Soviet tanks had rolled, these big doors in the mountainside would have opened, and Swiss jets would have shot out like bolts from Wilhelm Tell's crossbow. Swiss defense craziness. It wouldn't be the first time. And in fact the jets were still there, racked on their launch slides. Little things like cruise missiles with stubby wings and bubble cockpits. Obviously outdated and old-fashioned, like weapons from the set of a James Bond movie. New cruise missiles made these things look like rowboats in a marina, like shillelaghs in a museum. It was a newer kind of warfare, she thought wearily, that had gotten her invited into this hidden fortress. They weren't just protecting her now, she guessed, nor her ministry. It was Switzerland itself under attack. This she gathered from the people there to greet her. The assault on the ministry had been part of a larger attack, one of them confirmed to her. Viruses had sabotaged not just the ministry's computers but other UN agencies based in Switzerland, and more importantly, their banks. So it was an emergency. They were on a war footing now, but for this new kind of war, invisible and online for the most part, but also including the possibility of drones and of fast-targeted missiles. So now defending her ministry was part of defending Switzerland. And as this museum fortress served to show, the Swiss were very intent to defend themselves. Small country in a big world, as was explained to her by a Swiss military man as he escorted her along a big tunnel to a conference room deeper inside the mountain. Unusual things became necessary. He introduced himself. Turned out he was the country's defense minister. She sat down at a long table, suppressing a groan of relief, and was joined by a circle of officials. Such a relief to sit down. Her legs were throbbing. She glanced around the room. It was broad and low-ceilinged, its long back wall made of the green-black gneiss of the mountain itself, cut and polished like an immense facet of semi-precious stone. Overhead, a ceiling that seemed to be white ceramic glowed everywhere with a powerful diffuse luminosity. Mary felt her face burning, knew by that feeling that she was sunburnt and trail-dusted. Wiped out. Alpenverbraucht, Priska had called it. Alp-wasted. She looked around, saw that everyone at the table recognized how she felt, and knew the feeling well. They had been there, they understood her state. One of them shuffled his papers, glanced at his phone, waiting for something. Then 7 people walked into the room together. The Executive Council. Mary understood suddenly. All 7 of their presidents. The 7-headed president of Switzerland sat down across the table from her. 5 women, 2 men. She didn't know their names. They spoke in English. Of course this was for her sake, but a question distracted her as she tried to attend to them. She wondered what language they would speak if they were just among themselves. She dismissed the thought and tried to concentrate on what they were saying, too exhausted to reply, almost to understand. Some were French speakers and some German, she thought, although with the Swiss it wasn't as easy to tell which was which as it would have been with actual French and Germans. And especially not now. It felt like she was reeling in her seat. One of the presidential women told her that they had come here to meet her because they were now confronted with a crisis that seemed to have something to do with her. The recent attack on her ministry was part of a larger attack. Also under assault were the UN offices in the country, Interpol, the World Bank offices in Geneva, and Switzerland itself. The international order, in effect, was now under attack. Attack by whom? Mary asked. A long pause as the 7 presidents looked at each other. We don't know, admitted one of the women. Suisse romande Marie Langlois, it came to Mary. A Credit Suisse veteran. She went on, there's been an attack on our banking regulators that appears to have come from the same source as the attack on the Ministry for the Future. I see, Mary said, though she didn't. Did your ministry plan the hostage-taking of Davos? Langlois asked. Don't know, Mary said sharply. Then she added, but maybe those people had it coming, right? Did anyone really regret that? We did, one of the others said. Unfriendly silence. Mary let it stretch out. Their move, she felt. Although none of them seemed to agree. What did they do to your banks? She asked at last. They looked around at each other. We are not bankers, Langlois said, though she was, so we can't go into the details. But the attack apparently compromised many secret Swiss bank accounts. Revealed them? Mary asked. No. Private accounts are encrypted in multiple ways. They could not be revealed. But now the banks themselves are having trouble accessing files that decode owners' ID in order to contact them, and so on. So the danger is not so much exposure of clients as loss of fundamental information. Mary said, your banks can't figure out who owns what? Somewhat the case, one of the others admitted. Another banker, Mary thought. Out of 7 Swiss presidents, how many came from a banking background? 4? 5? Of course it would eventually get sorted out, one of the presidents said. Information all on paper and in cloud, as of course it should be. Time machine storage. It took Mary a second to understand this meant a computer backup. But still, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, there was depositor fear. Even panic. Not good for stability. Mary nodded. Silence as they watched her. She saw they were here to listen to her. She began to talk to them, almost as if thinking aloud to herself. Why not? She was too tired to find and apply her usual filters. It's the mystery of money, she said. Numbers that people trust, unlikely from the get-go. But then if that trust was lost, boom, it was gone. Meanwhile, they were all part of a global financial system that had become so complex that even the people running it didn't understand it. She looked around at them as she said this. Yes, she meant them. An accidental megastructure, she went on, enjoying the sound of J.S. phrase, right at the heart of society. Right in this secret Swiss mountain fortress, which ultimately protects not just your countryside and your society, but your banks, which means also people's trust in civilization, their faith in a system that no one really understands. The 7 parts of the presidency regarded her. Mary felt a fog pass through her. Then she came to, it seemed, and became aware of them again. What do you want from this situation? She asked curiously. They wanted the Ministry for the Future defended, they told her. Even strengthened. Just as part of Switzerland's own defense. They wanted better ways to make a better future, as part of making a safer Switzerland. It wasn't as if the country's 8 million people could live off what could be manufactured and grown in Switzerland alone. Country half the size of Ireland to start with, and 65% of that mountains, useless to humans. The remaining 35% an agglomeration, satisfying human needs, as best they could. They did what they could, but were part of a larger world. Not self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency was a dream, a fantasy, sometimes of xenophobic nationalists, other times just a decent wish to be safer. Swiss people mostly realistic, which meant being honest about what is possible. Thus engagement with the world. So they wanted her ministry to succeed, because they wanted Switzerland to succeed, which meant the world had to succeed. The future had to succeed. That would take planning, it would have to be engineered. All this is well enough, Mary told them. It's our project too. But you can do more than you are. Right now you're not doing enough. She almost laughed as she heard herself doing a version of what Frank had done to her that night. But not a good idea to laugh at them for no obvious reason, and she suppressed it, recalling suddenly that vivid night, the way she had been transfixed by Frank's scorn. What had made his accusations so compelling? Because here they were not so convinced she could see that. They thought they were doing all they could. As had she, before Frank caught her. She asked if their banks really knew who their depositors were, even when their records were not damaged. They looked puzzled at this. I ask, Mary said, getting irritated. Frank had been more than irritated, because your banks are often regarded as tax havens because of their secret accounts. Other countries lose tax money, which gets put in secret accounts here. So you're rich in part because you're the bagman for criminals worldwide. A kind of organized theft. People are supposed to trust money, but then a lot of it gets stolen by the very structure of money itself. Very unfriendly silence at this. Mary saw that and pressed harder. She might even have stood up if she could have mustered the energy. She might have shouted. It was time for redemption for Switzerland, she told them flatly, keeping right inside the line of civility. Or maybe on the edge of it. All that stuff you want to forget as if it never happened, the Nazi gold, the Jewish gold, the tax havens for oligarchs and kleptocrats, the secret bank accounts for criminals of all kinds. It's time to end all that. End the secrecy in your banks. Blockchain all your money, and put all your ill-gotten gains to good use. Leverage it for good. Forge an alliance with all the other small prosperous countries that can't save the world by themselves. All of you rich little countries join together, and then join up with India. Follow India's lead. Create more carbon coins by way of investments in carbon drawdown. That's the safest currency there is now. Far safer than the Swiss franc, for instance. Stabler. More stable. Your best choice at this point. Some of them were shaking their heads at this. You need to join the world. Mary insisted. You've always been Switzerland alone, the neutral one. We joined the Paris Agreement, one of them objected. And Interpol, said another. And the United Nations, said a third. We've always been engaged, another clarified. Okay, Mary conceded. But now, join the carbon coin. Gather the rich small nations into a working group. Help get us to the next world system. New metrics, new kinds of value creation. Make the next political economy. Invent post-capitalism. The world needs it. It really has to happen. And you've got to change your banks now anyway to recover from this attack. So change them for good. Make them better. Silence. Mary looked at them. Alp-wasted. Yes, indeed. A feeling everyone in the room had felt. Descend back into the world. After an ascent to that higher realm one encountered in the Alps, an encounter with the sublime. Otherworldly, visionary. Then afterward exhausted, sun-blasted, clarified. Transparent to the world, lofted into a higher realm. Mary knew she had an intense look she could fix on people, her laser, Martin had called it. She had known it all her life, even in childhood when she had been able to freeze people in place, even her mother. Now she leveled it on these people facing her, and they too went still. Something had set her off, her exploded office, her cramping legs. The Alps. She lasered them. The Swiss presidents shivered collectively, shaking her off. They looked around the table at each other. Not happy. Not angry. Not panicked. Not dismissive. They were thinking. Chapter 64. Once John Maynard Keynes wrote of the euthanasia of the rentier class. This is a very provocative, not to say ominous, phrase. Euthanasia was a 1930s euphemism, one of many phrases used in that period to refer to state-sponsored execution of any perceived political rivals. A century later, it still sounds deadly. But it appears that Keynes used the word only to mean something like putting some poor creature out of its misery by a relatively painless procedure. This is true to the original Greek. In literal translation, euthanasia means something like a good death. Dictionary: the painless killing of a patient suffering from an incurable and painful disease or in an irreversible coma. The practice is illegal in most countries. Mercy killing is one synonym. First use in written language is in Suetonius, describing the Emperor Augustus's happy death. First use in describing a medical practice is by Francis Bacon. Relief from suffering was crucial to the early connotation of the word. Now, it could be argued that the rentier class is not suffering, and in fact is happily engaged in eating up everything. A parasite killing its host by overindulgence is not suffering, in which case, really the rentier class needs to be executed. But perhaps it is overstating the case to compare the alteration of certain tax and inheritance laws to execution. Although possibly more than changes in tax and inheritance laws would be required to bring an end to the rentier class, often called the ruling class. Still, the concepts get blurred on a regular basis. A shift in social structures is often regarded as a kind of killing. On the other hand, the name for a certain kind of fiscal decapitation is called taking a haircut, which clarifies just how minor and even trivial are most of the financial limitations on wealth that get considered in the neoliberal hegemony. Euthanasia. For the good of the person killed. Now this is interesting because capitalism is not a person and the rentier class as such, though made up of people, is not a person. And as a class it is suffering, one could argue, from guilt, anxiety, depression, shame, a surfeit of everything, a sense of irredeemable criminal culpability, and so on. So to put this class out of its misery would be to relieve the individuals in that class from that horrible psychic burden, and possibly release them to a fuller, happier life, as guilt-free humans on a planet of equally guilt-free humans. Capitalism, after a long and vigorous life, now incurable, living in pain, in a coma, become a zombie, without a plan, without any hope of returning to health. So you put it out of its misery. But what about banishment? What about exile? What about a really short haircut? The criminals in earlier times could simply be banished and not allowed to return to their home territory. A punishment which did not match a mortal crime with another mortal crime. A judgment and a harsh punishment sometimes, but also it could be simply a chance to start over somewhere else, being the same person you were before. It all depended on circumstances. The rentier class. Keynes meant by this the people who made money simply by owning something that others needed and charging for the use of it. This is rent in its economic meaning. Rent goes to people who are not creators of value, but predators on the creation and exchange of value. So, the euthanasia of the rentier class was Keynes's way of trying to describe a revolution without revolution, a reform of capitalism in his time, toward whatever subsequent post-capitalist system might follow. It was his evaluation of the parts of the already existing system for their possible use value in a future civilization. He did not suggest ending capitalism, just end rent and rentiers. Although that very well might come to the same thing in the end. He might have been using a euphemism to conceal the shock of his suggestion. A just civilization of 8 billion, in balance with the biosphere's production of the things we need. How would that look? What laws would create it? And how can we get there fast enough to avoid a mass extinction event? The rentier class will not help in that project. They are not interested in that project. Indeed, that project will be forwarded in the face of their vigorous resistance. Over their dead bodies, some of them will say, in which case, euthanasia may be just the thing. Chapter 65. We were slaves in that mine. Of course, they told us we could leave if we wanted, but we were in the desert backside of Namibia and no way to get away, nowhere to go. We would have had to walk hundreds of kilometers without food or even hats to cover our heads. On the other hand, if we stayed, we got fed. 2 meals a day, 10-hour workday, Sundays off. Hurt bad enough, and you could go to the clinic and nurse would look at you, maybe a doctor if it bad enough. Broken bones were set. Dysentery pilled and ived. There were about 500 of us. All men except for some of the nurses and cooks in the mess hall. Most from Namibia, some from Angola and Mozambique and SA and Zimbabwe. Most of us operated machinery or worked on it, but there was some digging too. Digging out machinery after collapses. Bodies too sometimes. It was a pit mine. Open hole in the earth. Made in the shape of an oval that widened a valley that might have been there before. Roads spiraling down toward hell. Red rock of iron ore, and there were some yellow and greenish patches we were supposed to look for and dig out into separate trucks. We didn't even know what was in those colored rocks. Gold? Uranium? Rare earth, some called it. Not so rare there, but mostly it was red rock. Iron ore, common as dirt, and yet we were slaves to its taking. Then a bad time came in the kitchens. Less food every week, and the water tasted of iron and made people sick. Finally, one of the dorms got up one morning and sat down outside the kitchens. "Feed us right or we won't work," they chanted together in a chant. Looking at them sitting there, you could see they were desperate. They were scared men. We all saw it, and one by one we went and sat down beside them until every single miner in that mine was sitting there in the morning sun, expecting to get killed. Drones buzzing overhead like flies. It could have just as easy been these flies killed us as anything. The guards with their machine guns just watched us, like we were all waiting for something. Which we were, be it death or whatever. No matter what it was, it couldn't be worse than what we were living. So it felt good to sit there that morning in the sun, scared and sweating. We were brothers in that moment in a way we had never been while working. Finally, a man came out with a bullhorn. We knew he was just the voice for a higher power. The mine was owned by Boers from SA or China or somewhere far away. We heard all kinds of things. This voice was speaking for them, whoever they were. It said, "Get back to work and we'll feed you." We sat there. Someone yelled, "Feed us, and we'll get back to work." So there it stood. We weren't going to budge unless they fed us. They weren't going to feed us unless we budged. We talked it over with the men near us. Everyone agreed. Might as well die now and get it over with. We encouraged each other to stick to that. It was that bad. We were scared. Meanwhile, the cloud of drones had been growing overhead, like vultures flocking over some dead body on the veldt. There were more drones up there than there were people on the ground. They hung there more like mosquitoes than vultures, with the same sort of whine as mosquitoes, but bigger. Most about as big as dinner plates, some bigger. Their whine cut at your head and itched in your belly. Then all the drones, or almost all, came swooping down fast like hawks, and we rose to our feet shouting our dismay, and throwing our arms overhead and ducking down, and the like. But the drones all went at the guards. They surrounded them, dozens to each man, packed around them like coffins made of stacked black buzzing plates. One guard shot his gun, and his cloud of drones collapsed on him and felled him to the ground somehow. We couldn't see what they did to him, but he didn't move, and the other guard saw that, and no more shooting. Then the drones spoke together, first in Ashawambo, then Afrikaans, Swahili, English, Chinese, other languages I couldn't name. "We are from the African Union Peace and Security Council. This mine has been nationalized by the new Namibian government and will be protected from now on by Afropol's security forces. All countries of the African Union are now united in support of the Africa for Africans program. Representatives from the Namibian government and the AU will arrive shortly to help you with this transition. Please stay seated or feel free to move into the dining halls or dormitories while the armed personnel here are escorted off the premises." Which we were happy to do. The guards left on foot down the road. We cheered. We hugged our brothers. We cried for joy. The cooks broke into the pantries and freezers and made us a proper meal, trusting that more food would come in time to make up for the shortage they were creating, which eventually it did. Troops from the AU arrived that night and declared us liberated. Nationalized, they said. Told us that now we were worker owners of the mine if we wanted to stay. If not, free to get on buses and ride away. Some of us left as soon as the buses showed. Most of us stayed. We figured we could leave later if we wanted. But being an owner of the mine sounded interesting. We wanted to know what that meant. Like sweat equity, some said. Sweat equity. Hell, we had blood equity in that mine. Chapter 66. You think your birth was hard. My mom exploded. Literally, yes, in that when she went supernova the heat of the detonation exceeded 100 megakelvins, and in that pressure 3 helium nuclei stripped of their 2 electrons were crushed together, and there I was, as elegant as anything in the universe. Carbon, the king of the elements, sweetly six-sided and tetravalent, able to bond with the atoms of my kind in several different ways, and to compound with other atoms in almost countless ways, being so friendly. So, boom. And there I was, flying across the universe. My particular neighborhood was your Milky Way, and I flew right into the knot of dust that was swirling down into Sol, where I could very easily have been roasted or crushed into something else entirely, but happily for me I fell into a swirl of dust that was coming together around 90 million miles from mighty Sol, and not too much time later, I was part of a rocky planetesimal. Earth, you're probably guessing since we're here now, but actually I first joined the Mars-sized rock coalescing at the Lagrange 5-point to Earth, a rock which now gets called Theia. So I was there for that big collision when Theia hit Gaia at speed, and they merged and tossed out a spray that quickly became the moon. A Big Bang. Although not compared to the real Big Bang, of course. And with that I found myself inside the hot new Earth, but in the mantle very near the surface, luckily for me, or I wouldn't be talking to you now. That was it for my catastrophic childhood and youth. Everything since has been fairly sedate, and what you might call adult. Well, but I forget my escape to the surface. That was pretty dramatic too. I came out in a volcanic eruption at a mid-ocean ridge between Pangaea, and I forget what land mass. They go away pretty fast. Hot lava sprayed into the sky, cooling almost instantly. A few million years exposed to the photon rain of sunlight softened me up. It was like getting a sunburn, and I was part of the dead skin about to get sloughed off. Fine, I was ready. A million years is a long time, not to mention 50 million years. But the question was, which atoms would I join to effect my escape? I wanted to be eaten by a dinosaur, Jurassic era, and in those days it wasn't that hard. Photons banged me. My 4 exposed connector electrons were all quivering tetravalently, hoping for a pickup, and as it so often happens, I got interest from 2 suitors at the same time. And wham bang, I had been stuck simultaneously to 2 oxygen atoms, and I was in a marriage very convenient indeed as carbon dioxide. We made a good team. Life got busy. By flying low we kept getting picked up by plants. They would suck us in and zoop, gurgle, I was part of a leaf, a twig, a tree trunk. I joined a protosequoia. That was a long date, then a fern, got eaten by an allosaur, pooped by same allosaur. Yes, I was a piece of shit then, and have been many times since, but bacteria love to eat shit, and quickly enough I ran into another pair of oxygen atoms, and off again. But then, disaster. I was caught underwater in a muddy clutch of my fellow carbon atoms, and down we went back into the earth, crushed there to graphite, in this case a seam of coal, where I spent many millions of years. Could even have been sucked down tectonically and crushed to diamond, and thus stuck forever in one small town of everyone the same, latticed in a veritable jail for all time, meaning really till the burning up of the earth when the sun goes large. That would be my welcome release from that fate, but in this case I got lucky. My seam was mined by humans and burnt in a furnace, around the year 1634. Freedom. Back into the sky, and how I loved that. I like variety. So back to the sky, and hooray for organic chemistry. I was this and that, pangolin and rice stalk, mosquito and frog poop and bacteria. Then back to the sky yet again, hurrah. There's that moment that comes when the water molecules drifting around in the air constellate on a tiny speck of dust and become a raindrop and begin their dive to Earth, and you can latch onto that. Just get smacked by a downward droplet and join those happy people. Your oxygen mates singing hi to the oxygen atoms in their hydrogen twin marriages. Trios are the best, everyone partying for the time of the dive. You lose the sense of gravity pulling on you when you fall at terminal velocity for your droplet. In fact, sometimes you get hung up in a cloud or a mist or a fog, and it's just delightful, a delicious no-G sensation. I would suppose that it might be like what you would call orgasm. Bonding, sure. That can be good or bad, but floating in the sky in an orgasmic cloud, wow. But eventually the droplets are likely to coalesce until you are pelting down again. Snow is fun, sleet even more so. And then you crash onto Earth and things start again.
Who would I join this time?
Well, shit, not this time. Turns out that people in Canada had begun to deal with asbestos mine tailings by feeding the toxic rubble into the tailing pools that form in and next to mine pits, then adding some local cyanobacteria. These cyanobacteria grabbed me and then bonded with the asbestos dust, and together we clumped into hydromagnesite, a form of magnesium carbonate. These local kidnappers were all happy to have locked me and many of my mates down again, and the asbestos too, but when you floated in fog and body surfed through an alimentary tract, sitting there in a rock is boring as hell. My only hope is that I'll get ground up and used as a rock climber's hand powder. That's about all magnesium carbonate is good for. Maybe I'll end up in the powder pouch of some awesome cliff climber. That would be exciting, but for now I'm stuck. Oh well, time for a nap. Chapter 67. Taxes are interesting. They are one way governments guide a society and fund governmental activities, more the former than the latter. They are as old as civilization, an ancient manifestation of the power of the state. It's possible that both debt and money were invented in the earliest cities, specifically in order to enable and regularize taxation, both of them being forms of IOU. Progressive taxation refers to the idea that the more citizens own, the higher their rate of taxation. A regressive tax takes more, proportionally to individual wealth, from the poorest. Income taxes tax individual or corporate annual income, so these incomes are often manipulated by those earning them to appear lower than they really are. Various deferments and reinvestments and other methods slip money through tax loopholes, and tax havens are places where money, if it can be moved there before the annual accounting takes place, will not be taxed by the haven's host, or will be taxed much less. So a progressive income tax can become quite ineffective as such. Vigilance in application is required. At certain moments in history, excess personal wealth was frowned on, and the scale of progressive taxation grew quite steep. In the early 1950s, a time when many people felt that wealthy individuals had helped to cause and then profit from World War II, the top tax bracket in the United States had earners paying in income tax 91% of all earnings over $400,000, current value, for $1 million. This rate was approved by a Republican Congress and a Republican President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who had commanded the Allied forces in the war and had seen the death and destruction firsthand, including the concentration camps. Later, these top rates were lowered over and over until in the neoliberal period top rates were more like 20 or 30%. In those decades, the tax loopholes and dodges and deferments and havens also grew hugely, so these already low percentages are actually inflated compared to the real amounts collected. Income taxes thus were made much less progressive. This was a feature of the neoliberal period, part of the larger campaign favoring private over public, rich over poor. Capital asset taxes, sometimes called Piketty taxes, tax the assessed value of whomever or whatever is being taxed. Usually these have been applied to corporations, but the same kind of tax can be applied to individuals. France taxed its corporations 1% of their assessed value per year, and if applied globally, the effects of such a tax could be very significant. These asset taxes, too, could be made progressive, such that the larger the corporation, or the assessed value of any asset, such as property, the higher the annual tax taken from it. If set steeply enough, a progressive tax of this sort would quickly cause big corporations to break up into smaller companies to decrease their tax rate. Land taxes, sometimes called George's taxes, after an economist named Henry George, are taxes on property, meaning in this case specifically land itself as an asset. Again, these land taxes could be set progressively such that larger properties, or more valuable properties by way of location, or land not lived on by its owner, got taxed at a higher rate. As a great deal of profit and liquid assets more generally get turned into real estate as soon as possible, usually to own something tangible, the value of which is likely to rise over time, or at least not disappear entirely in a bubble's burst, a land tax properly designed could again swiftly redistribute land ownership more widely, while quickly swelling government coffers in order to pay for public work, thus reducing economic inequality. A tax on burning fossil carbon, which could be called not a tax but rather paying the true cost, could be set progressively or offset by feebates to avoid harming the poorest who burn less carbon but also need to burn what they burn to live. A fossil carbon tax set high enough would create a strong incentive to quit burning it. It could be set quite high, and on a schedule to go even higher over time, which would increase the incentive to quit burning it. Tax rates on the largest uses could be made prohibitive, in the sense of blocking all chance of profits being made from any derivative effects of these burns. If all fiat money everywhere went digital and got recorded in blockchains so that its location and transaction history could be traced and seen by all, then illegal tax dodges could be driven into non-existence by sanction, embargo, seizure, and erasure. Thus, it will be seen that a fully considered and vigorous tax regime, using digital trackable currencies and instituted by all the nations on Earth by way of an international treaty brokered by the UN or the World Bank or some other international organization, could quickly stimulate rapid change in behavior and in wealth distribution. Some might even call it revolutionary change. And, of course, taxes are a legal instrument with a pedigree as long as civilization itself, its rates decided by legislatures and backed by the full force of the state, meaning ultimately the judiciary, police, and military. Taxes are legal, in other words, and accepted in principle and used by all modern societies. So, targeted changes to the tax laws. Would that really be a revolution if it were to happen? It would be interesting to try it and see. Chapter 68. Mary was flown back to Zurich in a military helicopter. They landed at Cloten, and she was taken into town in a black van like the one she had left Zurich in. She sat next to Priska, watched their driver take the usual route into the city. But then where? Home, as it turned out. Hochstrasse, stopping curbside in front of her apartment building. Here, she asked. Just to get some of your stuff, Priska said. They don't think it's a good idea for you to live here anymore, I'm sorry. Where, then? We have a new safe house up the hill, Priska said. We would like you to stay there. Once the situation becomes a little more clear, you can move back here. If that's all right with you. Mary didn't reply. She wanted to be at home in her place, but also the idea made her nervous. Who was watching, if anyone?
And why?
She went in and packed a couple of big suitcases they provided. As she did, she glanced around the place. She had lived here 14 years. The Bonar prints on the walls, the white kitchen, they looked like a museum recreation. That stage of her life was over. This was like walking around in a dream. Her legs were still throbbing. She needed to sleep. Shower and bed, please. But not here. They carried the suitcases for her, down the stairs and into the street, into the back of the van. Then off east, past the little trattoria she had sat in on so many nights, reading as she ate. Farther up the Zuriberg, into the stolid residential neighborhood on the side of the hill. These big old urban houses were worth millions of francs each. They gleamed with the finish of all that money, unremarkable boxes though they were. The van turned into the gated driveway of one of them, the driveway just a concrete pad the size of one vehicle, in the middle of a garden behind a tall white plastered wall topped with broken green glass shards, an unexpected touch of evil in all this bourgeois conformity. A gate closed off the driveway and made it a compound. Her new home. She stifled a groan, kept her eyes from rolling. She could still walk to work from here, if they would let her, which they did. She could call, and within minutes a little club of them would be gathered at the walk-in gate to escort her down the hill to Hochstrasse and the ministry offices, their blown-up building being rebuilt, the rest already reoccupied. She was surprised that the Swiss security people felt it was safe to go back, but she was assured that the area was now surveilled in ways that made it safer there than anywhere else. They couldn't function from hiding, and it was important to show the world that Switzerland and the UN considered the ministry to be a crucial agency. Also that terrorism couldn't change the momentum of history. They were going to defend that principle, and she was one of the living avatars of history in their time. Or just bait, Mary thought. Bait in their trap, perhaps. But then again her team was reassembled and back in their offices or jammed into replacement offices, doing their familiar work. Possibly the Swiss had caught the people who had attacked them and thus eliminated the danger. Their banks were said to be back online and functioning as before. Whether there were structural changes included in the reboot wasn't clear yet. So if those assailants had been caught or rendered inoperative somehow, possibly they were safe now. There couldn't be that many people in the world who felt a toothless UN agency was worth attacking. Although the Paris Agreement had enemies, sure. It could be that the entire military apparatus of some vicious petrostate was now aimed right at her, as the symbol of all that was going wrong for them. It would be great to take some of those petrostates down, somehow. Jail their leaders, or the like. But thinking of prison reminded her of Frank. Did she want to see him? Alas, she did. Possibly something in her wanted to make sure he was still locked up. Maybe she was still afraid of the idea of him at large. But also, given that he was certainly going to be there, seeing him had to be more than just that. It felt like some kind of duty, which feeling also had its interests. It was impossible to deny that he had caught her interest. Downtown on a tram like any ordinary person. This was all right with her Minders, as long as one or more of them accompanied her. She glanced at the people in her tram car, wondering who they were. None of them looked likely. She recalled a line from a children's book she had loved, something like, "If you want to claim to be our queen, while yet always invisible and unknown to us, you are welcome to the task." It was the same now. If you're going to guard me but I don't see you, fine, do it. Down at Hauptbahnhof she got off and walked the narrow downtown pedestrian streets to the Gefängnis. So characteristic of the Swiss to keep the old jail downtown. Why proclaim one part of the city to be more valuable than any other? The whole point of a city was to smush the whole society together and watch it function anyway. Daily life, some kind of flâneurs bricolage. An agglomeration, as their urban designers called it, unembarrassed by the ugliness of the word in English. She checked into the prison without fuss and went to Frank's dorm. He was in the living area there, reading a book. He looked up and his eyebrows rose. "I thought you were run out of town." "I was. They let me come back." She sat down on a couch across from him. "What are you reading?" He showed her the cover, an Inspector Maigret omnibus. In a dark world, she thought, a place of safety. Diagnose the evil. Everyone should have a Mrs. Maigret. "How's it going?" she asked, wondering as always why she had come, what she could say. "It's okay," he said. "They let me out during the day. I work at the same place I was working before." "The refugee center?" "Yeah, they're expanding again. I've been there so long I've become a fount of institutional wisdom." "I doubt that." He laughed, surprised. "How come?" "We're in Switzerland. The institutional wisdom all gets written down." "You would think. Anyway, I'm there." "Feeding people?" "Most of the time I'm in processing." "What does that mean?" "People arrive and we try to figure out where they got Dublined, if anywhere." "It must have been somewhere, right?" "No coastlines in this Bohemia." He shook his head. "Smugglers. They get to Greece or the Balkans. They don't want to get registered there. Switzerland has a reputation for quality, in this as in everything. Despite the kind of attack that got you arrested. But it's worse everywhere else. So they want to come here, and then get Dublined. A lot of them have mangled their fingerprints so you can't ID them that way. Which means they probably got Dublined somewhere else." "Sure." "So, what do you do? If we find out they were tagged elsewhere, we have to send them back there. So, we don't try very hard. Most of them we can register here, fingerprints or not. They use retinal scans here. Then we try to find room for them in camps that already have people from their country." "Where are they from?" "Everywhere." "Are they climate, political, economic?" "You can't tell the difference anymore. If you ever could." "So you think you're getting real refugees?" He gave her a look. "No one would leave home if they didn't have to." "Okay, so you get them registered here, then you send them to a camp where they'll have people from their country?" "We try." "But you don't visit the camps?" "No. I have to be back here by 8 every night." "Well, but you can get almost anywhere in Switzerland and back by 8. "That's true. But I'm not supposed to leave the canton." "Doesn't Zurich have any camps?" "Yes, and I've gone to them. There's a big one out beyond Winterthur, in an old airport or something. 20,000 people there. I see how they're doing. Help in the kitchen. That's what I like. Although I can help in the kitchen here too. Does that get you time off?" "I think so. I'm not so worried about that anymore. I don't have anywhere to go." She regarded him for a while. "Did you ever spend any time in the Alps?" she asked at last. "A little bit." "They're amazing." He nodded. "They look steep." "They definitely are." She told him about her crossing of the Frundenjach. He seemed interested in her tale, which to her was about the Alps, but when she was done he said, "So, who do you think was after you?" "I don't know." "Who loses the most when your ministry does well?" She shrugged. Oil companies? Billionaires? Petrostates. That's not a giant list of suspects. I don't know, she said. It could be anyone, I suppose. Maybe it was some individual or small group that they've caught. It would make sense if it was just some nut who thought we were the important ones, when actually we're just a cog in a giant machine. But they might have thought you were the clutch. What does a clutch do again? He almost smiled, which was his smile. It clutches. It's where the engine connects to the wheels. Ah. Well, I don't know. Wouldn't your guards tell you if you asked them? I'm not sure. We're not that close. I mean, their job is to protect me. They might think I'm safer not knowing. Why would that be? I don't know. The Swiss banks were attacked too, so they're keeping pretty quiet about their counterattacks. He was smiling his little almost smile. He gestured at his book. You need an Inspector Maigret. He liked to explain things to the people he saved. Or, if he thought it would make them reveal themselves to be the actual criminal. True. You've read them? A few. They're a bit too dark for me. The crimes are too real. People are twisty. They are. So, you need Inspector Maigret. And you need the Alps. A woman and girl entered the room, and Frank looked startled. Oh, hi, he said, then looked at Mary and back at the two who had just entered. He didn't know what to say. Mary saw. Nonplussed, confused. He stood up. This is Mary Murphy, he told the two. Then to her. These are my family. Mary squinted. The woman's mouth had tightened at the corners. The girl, about 10 or 11 years old, broke to Frank and lifted the tension. Jake. Hey, Hibba. How are you? Good. The girl gave Frank a hug. Frank leaned awkwardly into it, looked over the girl's shoulder at the woman. How did you get here? We took the train. Where do you live? Mary asked her. We stay at the refugee camp outside Bern. Ah. How is that? She shrugged. She was looking at Frank. Listen, I'll let you all catch up, Mary said, standing and holding a hand out to block Frank's objection. It's okay, I should be going anyway. And I'll come back soon. All right, he said, distracted still. Thanks for dropping by. Chapter 69. In Saudi Arabia, during the height of the Hajj, what appeared to be a coup by the military resulted in the deaths of an unknown number of Saudi princes. Reports ranged from 20 to 50, but no one knew for sure. The king was in New York at the time and was said to be in hiding and not planning on going home. He called on the world to support his legitimate government, and a few governments did, but none of them offered active help. The United States offered asylum. The new government had the backing of most of the people in the country, as far as anyone could tell, with the Hajj in disarray and 2 million Muslims either trying to complete their pilgrimage or get home. Confusion on the Arabian Peninsula was general. The only thing that was obvious in that first month was that no one outside the Arabian Peninsula knew very much about what had really been happening in Saudi Arabia, which was now to be called simply Arabia. The new government told the world. The Sauds were done. The other Sunni national governments were cautiously approving or disapproving of this removal, reserving their sharpest criticism for the disruption of the Hajj. No one had liked the Saud family, it now appeared, but the ramifications of this were unknown and potentially volatile throughout the region. The Shiite nations openly applauded the coup. Other governments around the world stayed reticent. They seemed to be trying to calculate what the change meant and what the new government would do, especially with its immense reserves of oil. The formerly implicit was now uncomfortably obvious. No one had cared about these people, only about their oil. Then word came from Riyadh that Arabians respected the pressing need to decarbonize the world's economy and intended to use their oil only for plastics manufacture and other non-combustible uses. The new Arabian government therefore made an immediate claim to the CCCB, the climate coalition of central banks, which recently had been established specifically to administer the carbon coin, saying that their full conversion to solar power, to begin immediately, and their refusal to sell their oil reserves for burning, deserved compensation in the form of the CCCB's newly created carbon coins, sometimes called carboni. At the rate of 1 coin per ton of secured carbon, the Arabic claim was estimated at about 1 trillion carbon coins. At current exchange rates, this came to several trillion US dollars, which would make Arabia instantly one of the richest countries on earth, at least in terms of national bank assets. If the present currency exchange rates held, they would be wealthier than if they had sold their oil for burning. After a period of delay, the CCCB agreed to this exchange, but stipulated it was to be paid out on a schedule pegged to how fast the Arabian oil would have been produced and burned in that now deactivated alternate history, only a bit front-loaded and accelerated to reward Arabia for doing the right thing for the planet and human civilization. Meanwhile, they could leverage this assured income stream, which they did. They accepted the deal and went to work. This sudden loss of supply sent oil prices and oil futures sharply up. Oil was rarer now, therefore more expensive, which meant that clean, renewable energy was now cheaper than oil by an even larger margin than before. And as the new carbon taxes being levied in every country in compliance with the latest commitments to the Paris Agreement, made at the COP43 meeting, were also scheduled to rise year by an increasing percentage, price signals were now all pointing toward clean renewables as the cheapest way to power the world. The social cost of carbon was finally getting injected into the price of fossil fuels, and that old saying, ridiculed by the fossil fuels industry for decades, was suddenly becoming the obvious thing, as being the most profitable or least unprofitable thing. Keep it in the ground. Soon after this, Brazil's government entered another paroxysm of corruption charges, leading to the resignation of the right-wing president and then his arrest. Quickly there followed the triumphant return of the so-called Lula left, now also called Clean Brazil, with a promise of clean government representing the entire populace, also an end to oil sales, clearly modeled on Arabia's move, also the full protection and caretaking of the Amazon basin's rainforest. They claimed compensation for this last policy also, to be paid in more of the CCCB's carbon coins. The CCCB agreed to that, and by way of Rebecca Tallhorse negotiations, a lot of carbon coins were also given immediately to the indigenous groups of the Amazon, who had been keeping the rainforest's carbon sequestered for centuries. That act of climate justice, along with newly scheduled payments to the Brazilian federal government, meant a few trillion more carbon coins were added to the general circulation, and now mainstream economists everywhere were fearful that this sudden flood of new currency was going to cause massive deflation. Or perhaps inflation. Macroeconomics was no longer so very clear on the ultimate effects of quantitative easing, given that the evidence from the past half-century could be interpreted either way. That this debate was a clear sign that macroeconomics as a field was ideological to the point of astrology was often asserted by people in all the other social sciences, but economists were still very skilled at ignoring outside criticisms of their field, and now they forged on contradicting themselves as confidently as ever. Some of them were asserting that the carbon coins were merely replacements for petrodollars, which had always been pulled out of the ground like rabbits out of a hat, having not existed before the oil was pumped up and sold. Pulled out of the ground, pulled out of a hat. Was there any real difference between petrodollars and carbon coins, these economists asked? There was, other economists insisted. Petrodollars had first been real pre-existing money, paid for a commodity turned into electricity or physical movement, thus turned into economic activity. Carbon coins, on the other hand, were created by the actual removal of that same electricity and transport potential from the world, and thus from the gross world product. Petrodollars thus fueled GWP. Carbon coins depleted GWP. They were functionally opposite. Then again, still others argued that absence of carbon burn, and even the resulting lowering of GWP itself, would save some difficult-to-calculate but real amounts of damage to the biosphere, also the necessary mitigation and remediation and ecological restoration work and insurance payouts that would have inevitably followed the carbon burn, and these costs could be calculated. And when they were, ultimately it seemed to amount to almost a wash, petrodollars or carbon coins, and thus the whole thing was a tempest in a teapot, a nothing in economic terms. So, either a huge boon, a complete calamity, or a non-event. Thus the economists, faced with explaining the biggest economic event of their time. What a science! They worked all over the world, including in the Ministry for the Future's offices, trying to calculate the gains and losses of this event in some way that could be entered into a single balance sheet and defended. But it couldn't be done, except in ways so filled with assumptions that each estimate was revealed to be an ideological statement of the viewer's priorities and values. A speculative fiction. Some pointed out that this had always been true of any economic analysis or forecast ever made. In this case, these people insisted, please go back to the basics. Here's the true economy, these people said. Since the Earth's biosphere was the only one available to humanity, and its healthy function absolutely necessary to humanity's existence, its worth to people was a kind of existential infinity. Gauging the price of saving the biosphere's functions against the cost of losing them would therefore always be impossible. Macroeconomics had thus long ago entered a zone of confusion, either early in the century or perhaps from the moment of its birth, and now was revealed for the pseudoscience it had always been. The upshot was that they had no real way of knowing what the global economy was doing now, or what would happen if the central banks continued to fulfill their pledge to create and underwrite a massive infusion of new money into the world. Carbon quantitative easing, CQE, was a huge multivariate experiment in social engineering. This was volatility indeed. To use not just the financial term, but simply common human language. It was without doubt a volatile situation. But recall that the financial markets of that time loved stock price volatility, as it made money for financiers no matter what happened, their having gone both long and short on everything. These were not economists, but speculators. Finance in that late moment of capitalism's exhaustion meant gamblers, sure, but more than that, the casino in which people gambled. And the house always won. And carbon coins were the best opportunity to go long ever created. Almost a kind of sure thing. So, in certain respects, the craziness of the time was simply good for investors. Those who had shorted fossil fuels and gone long on clean renewables were now making fortunes, and fortunes require reinvestment to actually be fortunes. Growth. Growth. This was the world's current reigning religion, it had to be admitted. Growth. It was a kind of existential assumption, as if civilization were a kind of cancer, and them all therefore committed to growth as their particular deadly form of life. But this time, growth might be reconfiguring itself as the growth of some kind of safety. Call it involution or sophistication, improvement, degrowth, growth of some kind of goodness. A sane response to danger, now understood as a very high-return investment strategy. Who knew? Really, no one knew. The remaining big petrostates each regarded the new situation uneasily, or even in a panic. Together they sat on fossil carbon reserves that at current market prices ranged into the hundreds of trillions. These reserves could easily become stranded assets in the very near future. In fact, it looked a bit like a financial bubble starting to burst. In that context, it made sense to sell as much of the product as possible before prices collapse completely. But if everyone holds a fire sale at once, who's going to buy? The small prosperous countries had clean renewable energy already. The shipping industries, under the duress of their ships being sunk if they didn't shift, had shifted already to wind and electrics and hydrogen. Aviation, under the same annihilating pressure, was shifting to electric planes and mainly airships. Ground transport was going entirely electric, and where it still used liquid fuels, was completely committed to renewable biofuels that bypassed fossil sources. Power plants were therefore the last interested customers, but even there, solar was cheaper and batteries getting better, and non-battery energy storage by way of water levels or salt temperatures or flywheels or air pressure were all becoming more and more robust. The developed petronations therefore tried to sell their oil to the developing non-petronations at a big discount. The developing petronations decided to power themselves with their own oil assets, and sold to their fellow developing nations without petro at even bigger discounts. These non-petro developing nations therefore were the last big carbon burners of note, and they were significant. But India had already shown what could be done by making their pivot to clean renewables after the heat wave. And China was leading the world in solar panel production. They were still selling and shipping their coal, and Japan was still importing it and burning it, among others. Russia and Australia were still exporting coal where they could. Despite all the sudden shifts, carbon was still being burned. Oh yes, to the tune of 20 gigatons a year. Did you think that because Arabia was virtuous, there would be no more cakes and ale? In fact, there was no quick end in sight. The image of a bubble bursting was apt in some respects, illusory in others. People still needed electricity and transport. Money still ruled. Fire sales still sold carbon. The bubble that was bursting might still be the biosphere itself. The battle for the fate of the Earth continued. Russia kept selling its oil and gas, which was a good thing for Europe, as much of Europe was heated in winter by Russian gas, as was made clear when the pipelines were bombed in the coldest part of that winter. They were also selling their Pebble Mob missiles. Either that or else they had sold or given or lost to theft or espionage the plans for building Pebble Mobs. And in fact, these missiles were not so hard to reverse engineer that they weren't quickly becoming a part of all major militaries. Even part of some private armed forces arsenals, it appeared, which had to have purchased such high-tech devices from some major country. It was in fact somewhat terrifying that anyone at all owned such missiles. They had been introduced by the Russians in the 2020s and spread rapidly after that. They spread faster than the spread of the implications of their existence. Nation-states kept spending billions that could have been used elsewhere on navies and air forces and military bases, none of which could be defended against these new weapons. They were more powerful than the atomic bomb. In this very particular sense, you could use them, and they couldn't be stopped. That was the main thing that was not being understood, either accidentally or on purpose, so that people wouldn't have to change their armaments or their purchase orders. These missiles couldn't be stopped. They were small. They launched from mobile launchers. They came from all directions in a coordinated attack in which they only congregated at their target in the last few seconds of their flights. They did not give off radioactive signals, and thus could be hidden until the moment of launch. And they were relatively cheap. After you launched them, they flew at about 1,000 miles an hour. That, and the fact they only coalesced to their mob moment in the last seconds before impact was enough to forestall any realistic defense against them. They were lethally explosive versions of the drones that had brought down all the planes on crash day. Aircraft carriers? Sunk. Bombers? Blown out of the sky. An oil tanker, boom, sunk in 10 minutes. One of America's 800 military bases around the world, shattered. Death and chaos, and no one findable to blame. The war on terror? It lost. Either everyone's happy or no one is safe. But we're never happy. So we'll never be safe. Or put it this way, either every culture is respected, or no one is safe. Either everyone has dignity, or no one has it. Because why? Because this. A private jet owned by a rich man, boom. A coal-fired power plant in China, boom. A cement factory in Turkey, boom. A mine in Angola, boom. A yacht in the Aegean, boom. A police station in Egypt, boom. The Hotel Belvedere in Davos, boom. An oil executive walking down the street, boom. The Ministry for the Future's offices, boom. What people then had to consider was that this list of targets could be greatly extended. The U.S. Capitol, various houses of parliament, the Kaaba in Mecca, the Forbidden Palace in Beijing, the Taj Mahal, and so on. No place on earth was safe. Meetings at Interpol and many other agencies concerned with global security were inconclusive as to the source or sources of these attacks when they happened. Although, as with the nerve gas made by the Russians and used to kill Russian dissidents in Britain, these pebble mobs were definitely complex military devices, not something you could cook up in your garage. They were nation-state devices, in effect, made for fairly big and sophisticated militaries by fairly advanced aerospace and computer companies, then sold or given to smaller actors. So, after the Interpol meetings, a rumor began to circulate that it was in Russia where the Arabian coup against the Saudi royal family had been planned. But wait, why would the Russians be party to that? Because with Arabian oil off the table, and then Brazilian oil too, Russian oil was that much more valuable. But this was speculation only. The Russian government denied all these rumors and identified them as part of the ongoing anti-Russian campaign common in the West and elsewhere. Nothing to it. Each nation responsible for its own security. Russia was a keeper of all its treaty obligations and a force for stability in the world. Pebble mobs might even be a force for good, because now war was rendered impossible. It was mutual assured destruction, not of civilian populations, but of war machinery. An end to the 20th century concept of total war, a return to the focus on military against military that had characterized armed conflict before the breakdown of civilized norms established at Westphalia in 1648, then forgotten in the 20th century. Now back again, but not really, because anything could be targeted. So it was not really military against military as Russia claimed, but anyone against anyone. If they could get hold of one of these assemblies. A heat wave hit Arizona, then New Mexico and West Texas, then East Texas, then Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, and the Florida Panhandle. For a week, the temperature/humidity index hovered around wet bulb 35, with temperatures around 110 F and humidity 60%. For the most part, electrical power remained functioning, and people stayed inside air-conditioned buildings. If they didn't have air conditioning themselves, or were nervous about losing it, they congregated in public buildings where it existed. All fine. But then the heat wave was met by a high-pressure cell coming up from the Caribbean, and the so-called double wave created wet bulb 38s, seriously fatal. Demand for power grew until there were power failures and brownouts, and even though some of these were planned to avoid blackouts, and all of them eventually contained and relatively brief, they still exposed millions to fatal levels of heat. Somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people died in a single day during that heat wave. Later, that figure was revised, as it was discovered over time that the previous decadal census had significantly undercounted the at-risk population. But no matter the exact number, it was huge. Not as large as the Great Indian Heat Wave had been, but this time it was Americans in America. That fact made a difference, especially to Americans. Although still, in the months that followed, people's biases emerged. It was the South where it had happened. It was mostly poor people, in particular poor people of color. It couldn't happen in the North. It couldn't happen to prosperous, white people. And so on. Arizona's part in it was forgotten, except in Arizona. This was yet another manifestation of racism and contempt for the South, yes, but also of a universal cognitive disability, in that people had a very hard time imagining that catastrophe could happen to them until it did. So until the climate was actually killing them, people had a tendency to deny it could happen. To others, yes. To them, no. This was a cognitive error that, like most cognitive errors, kept happening even when you knew of its existence and prevalence. It was some kind of evolutionary survival mechanism, some speculated, a way to help people carry on even when it was pointless to carry on. People living just 20 miles from a town flattened by a tornado in Ohio would claim that the flattened town was in the tornado track, and they were not, so it would never happen to them. The following week they might get killed, in the event itself surprised and feeling that this was an unprecedented freak occurrence, but meanwhile, until then, they swore it couldn't happen. That's how people were, and even the torching of the South didn't change it. CO2 levels that year were around 470 parts per million. They had gone from driving a car to hanging on to a tiger's tail. Hanging on for dear life. Chapter 70. COP meetings of the Paris Climate Agreement kept happening every year, despite the increasing sense of irrelevance everyone in attendance felt in the face of the world's ever-widening disasters. It was clear that the worsening situation vis-a-vis carbon in the atmosphere meant that many of the developing countries, those which could least afford to cope with climate catastrophes, were now being struck by weather disasters on a regular basis, and these were perhaps the prime drivers in the human conflicts now breaking out everywhere. For those who held to that perception of ultimate causes, the Paris Agreement remained something to hold on to, however weak it was beginning to look relative to the crisis. The UN's climate negotiations had always made a strong distinction between developed and developing nations, with lists of each specified, and repeated injunctions made that developed nations were to do more to mitigate climate problems than developing nations could. Much of this call for climate equity was spelled out in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Clause 2 of Article 2 states, "This agreement will be implemented to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances." Article 9's Clause 1 repeats this principle. Developed nations are to assist developing nations. They can and should do more than developing nations. These were crucial clauses in the agreement. The text of these articles and their clauses had been fought over sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, word by word. The delegates who had pushed hardest for the inclusion of these articles had given their all. They had spent years of their lives working for them. On the subway rides during summit meetings, they compared notes on divorces, bankruptcies, broken career paths, stress-related illnesses, and all the other personal costs accrued by throwing themselves so hard into this cause. Were they fools to have tried so hard for words, in a world careening toward catastrophe? Were they fools to keep on trying? Words are gossamer in a world of granite. There weren't even any mechanisms for enforcement of these so carefully worded injunctions. They were notional only, the international order of governance being a matter of nations volunteering to do things. And then when they didn't do them, ignoring the existence of their own promises. There was no judge, no sheriff, no jail. No sanctions at all. But what else did they have? The world runs by laws and treaties, or so it sometimes seems. So one can hope. The granite of the careening world, held in gossamer nets. And if one were to argue that the world actually runs by way of guns in your face, as Mao so trenchantly pointed out, still, the guns often get aimed by way of laws and treaties. If you give up on sentences, you end up in a world of gangsters and thieves and naked force, hauled into the street at night to be clubbed or shot or jailed. So the people who fought for sentences, for the precise wording to be included in treaties, were doing the best they could think of to avoid that world of bare force and murder in the night. They were doing the best they could with what they had. Now, as the situation continued to deteriorate, there were delegates at every annual conference of the parties who kept on focusing on words and phrases. Many of them were now arguing that all the young people on Earth, and all the generations of humans in the centuries to come, and all their cousin creatures on the planet who could never speak for themselves, especially in court, all these living beings added up to something like a poor and vulnerable developing nation, a huge one, appearing inexorably over the horizon of time. These new citizens were young and weak, in many cases utterly helpless. And yet they had rights too, or should have rights. And under the Paris Agreement's equity clauses, which every nation had signed, one could argue that they had rights equivalent to those of a developing nation. And without quick and massive efforts from the Annex I nations, meaning the developed world, the old rich countries, that giant new developing nation's development, even its very existence, looked less and less likely. So the COP meetings had to keep insisting on equity as a fundamental value and policy, which meant that support for the subsidiary body popularly known as the Ministry for the Future should continue to be supported in full. Chapter 71. Notes taken for Badham again, regular executive meeting with Mary and leadership group. The usual summary of points, plus impressions, B wants more. We'll clean this up later. Typing as they speak. I keep forgetting to go to the bathroom first. Badham next to Mary, silent, distracted. Tatiana Voznesenskaya next to him, also distracted. She's being sued back home, can't go to Russia safely, here no longer living in same place. Her report, lawsuits in over 100 countries. Also joined defense of nearly 400 groups being sued for doing good things. T not happy. Mbini, MFTF being attacked might have caused others to step up. African Union backing all nationalizations in Africa means a united front toward China, World Bank, all outside forces. Africa for Africans, the fastest growing party in every country there. Pressure on Nigeria in particular to claim the carbon coin like Arabia and Brazil. Doing so could fund a lot of other things. Basic infrastructure and education, then more. Possession of oil now seen as a curse to be exorcised. Chance here to help leverage good change. Africa led by Africans. Bob, Adele, Estevan in a team report. Mostly Antarctica. Test projects pumping water out from under glaciers getting positive results. Pine Island glacier slowed from hundreds of meters a year to tens of meters. We should help scale this up, support it fully. 60 Antarctic glaciers, 15 Greenland glaciers. Big push, but amazing cost benefit. Bang for buck. Let's do it. Am nodding. Kaming not so cheery. Rate of extinction still rising. Sumatran tiger, northern white rhinoceros, more river dolphins. These just the latest charismatics confirmed to be gone in wild. Orangutans next, along with 350 other mammal species in red zone danger of extinction. Indra, direct air capture now more powerful and less expensive, need to scale up appropriately, then find places to sequester billions of tons of dry ice. Progress being made in this technology means more should be invested in it, like most of the MFTF budget and a huge dose of carbon coins. Elena, the 4 per 1,000 movement has made an accurate, uncomplicated, inexpensive test kit for year-by-year changes in carbon in the soil. Measurement now possible. Need a whole army of certifiers to certify, then good to go. Mary, anyone paying farmers for losses incurred in transition to new AG methods? Elena, no. No payers found. Mary, but this is perfect for carbon coins. Why shouldn't they be getting carbon coins? Dick, the banks have to make it clear the carboni can be issued in fragments of a coin. Like carbon pennies. Elena, we would like to see that. But we're only just now able to quantify what's being sequestered. Also, defining sequestration becoming an issue. Dick, the standard definition from CCCB is being held in storage for a century. Mary, is that long enough? Dick, long enough for now. Kick the can down the road a century, not bad compared to not kicking it at all. Emergency definition in effect. Indra, this is part of why geoengineering no longer a useful word or concept. Everything people do at scale is geoengineering. Glacier slowdown, direct air capture, soil projects like 4 per 1,000, they're all geoengineering. Mary, but solar radiation management is definitely geoengineering. Indra, sure, but so what? The American heat wave has brought that one back again for sure. Indian results still debated. Claim that a double Pinatubo lowered global temperatures by 3 degrees for the 5 years following the event, a degree in the decade after that. Now we're back to pre-intervention levels. But so many confounding factors. All these figures contested. Mary, not in India. They're going to do it again. Indra generally agreed there that their intervention worked. So you can see why they might want to talk of it now also in U.S. Congress. Controversial. Meanwhile, we're working with CCCB to list all ways carbon drawdown could be quantified and confirmed in ways that would allow for carbon coins to be created and paid to individuals. All geoengineering, all good. The word itself needs to be rehabilitated. Mary, good luck with that. Dick, what's going on with finance? World still in super depression, but finance sailing along just fine. What's up? Dick, effect of carbon coins on global finance, a nice stimulus for them. Joking as usual. Finance unfazed by anything. Carbon coins just another tradable commodity, listed in currency exchanges just like any other currency. Betting on the spread between the stick and the carrot. Thus you see people shorting carbon coins, meaning the worse the climate does the more money they make. They've hedged the apocalypse. Mary, can we stop them? Dick, a falling price on carbon coin is a sign that the incentives to not burn carbon are not strong enough yet. Also, measurement of anything always leads to financialization of the measurement method itself. So, just the usual thing. Mary, what can we do to up the pressure on carbon burning? Dick, get WTO to change rules in ways that penalize carbon burn of any kind. Up carbon taxes progressively. Publicize sabotage of petro now happening more and more frequently. This will encourage more sabotage copycat style. In short, arbitrage and sabotage. Mary, haha, but some of us laughed for real. Dick, the market needs the state healthy to back money itself. The state needs the market healthy to keep the economy liquid. But state and market aren't working hand in hand. Or they're hand in hand, but only because they're arm wrestling, struggling for control of the situation they comprise together. Mary, and we want the state to win. Dick, states make laws, laws run the system. So yes, state is the crucial actor. But we can't just banish market. Not now. It's too big. It's the way of the world. We just have to force it to invest in the things we want. Badam nods at this. Janice Athena. Something Dick said before bombing hiatus struck those here in the AI group. Meaning J themselves, but they never use any pronouns referring to themselves. That ministry should form a sort of shadow government, Dick said, so that when the system breaks down, people have a workable plan B to turn to. So AI group has been trying to sketch a workable shadow government and put it up on websites. Plan B open source. We're seeing an increasing rate of uptake on your luck. Already a new internet. Now its users may be turning into a new kind of citizen of the world. Gaia's citizenship, or what have you. Earth citizen, Commons member, world citizen. One planet. Mother Earth. All these terms used by people who are coming to think of themselves as part of a planetary civilization. Main sense of patriotism now directed to the planet itself. Matriotism, Dick jokes. J nods. Support growing fast. Could cross a tipping point and become what everyone thinks. A new structure of feeling, underlying politics as such. Global civilization transcending local differences. A different hegemony for sure. Shadow government plans are just one part of that larger movement. Like a software for feeling. Mary, the global village. J, sort of. That's an old name. Not really a village. Planetary consciousness, biospheric governance, citizen of Gaia, one planet, Mother Earth, etc. More like that. Village, not really the right word. Batum. It should be an explicit religion like I've been saying. A call for devotion or worship. Mary, not hearing Batum. What about AI? Are your machines learning? J.A. squints, looking pained. Embarrassing question, somehow. Naive. Says, names here keep deceiving people. Data mining tells us things we wouldn't have known unless we did it. That could be called artificial intelligence, but it's what we used to call science. What we have really is computer-assisted science. Best to call it that. It's getting stronger. But we still have to figure out what to do with it. Main potential for advancement here is in human understanding. Mary, chop chop, cuts off Jay's vocabulary worries. Brings meeting to a close. She says, we probably got attacked because of something specific we were doing. The Swiss got attacked too, so now they're very much on our side and looking into it. That means it was probably financial, somehow. We may be able to see things they can't, you never know. Keep on the lookout for something of that nature. Because we're in some kind of crux now. Push has come to shove. Chapter 72. The Habitat Corridor idea was just one early move in the larger Half-Earth project, but first things first. With wild animals critically endangered everywhere, it was necessary to do what we could right now, without delay. And habitat corridors had an already existing tradition of methodologies and legal instruments already worked up. The famous Y2Y corridor, Yukon to Yellowstone, was going great. Not that this was the hardest corridor on Earth to establish, the Canadian Rockies being almost empty down their spine, and including a lot of federal and tribal land protected as parks and the like, on both sides of the border. Not to mention including two of the great remaining ecosystem populations, with the greater Yellowstone ecosystem animals prospering at the south end, and the Arctic ecosystem animals doing fairly well in the north, if you didn't count climate change melting their land or ice out from under them. Both populations might start migrating to the middle, but the corridor allowed them to do that. And both ecozones had relatively healthy populations of mammals and birds, in that they were not too poisoned, and big in number and geographical extent. As proof of concept, Y2Y has done wonders for showing people how it all could work. Animals had free passage up and down it and protection from hunting. Roads still active in the region had been given under and overpasses. Fences had breaks in them or were torn down entirely. Millions of animals were tagged, and thus now participating in the so-called Internet of Animals, which is basically a gigantic suite of scientific studies. It was not far from true that we had a better census going with the mammals and birds in the Y2Y corridor than we did for the humans in it. All good. And tacking on a Y2Y Cal, an east-west corridor from Yellowstone to Yosemite, had not been very difficult either. California was already in the vanguard of animal protection, going back to the days when they had saved the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep from extinction by an effort now being studied and copied all over the world, and around that same time they had forbidden outright the killing of mountain lions. Connecting that great bioisland to Yellowstone meant getting Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Oregon, and Nevada on board, and though there were political complications in all these states, the truth was they were mostly emptying of humans across huge swathes of their rural land, and if public and private entities were offered a good enough deal, which mainly just meant offering them enough money for conservation easement-like arrangements, they usually went for it. The corridors could be patched together, the interstates finessed by under- and overpasses, the hunting laws changed, and the nights in particular given over to animals, as they mostly always had been. People diurnal, animals nocturnal. This wasn't entirely just them trying to avoid us. A lot of them lived that way even in the wilderness. So lots of people were paid for motion-sensitive night photos of animals they sent to us like bounties in the old days, but reversed, people paid for keeping them alive rather than killing them. Local governments were often enthusiastic, sensing tourism, and various federal agencies like the Plan, especially BLM and the Forest Service, which for the purposes of this project were the two agencies that counted most. If we could keep under the radar in Washington, where assholes congregate and bray loudly about the God-given right to kill everything in creation without restraint, we could usually make corridor creation work quite well.
So, fine.
Corridors were extended from the south end of Y2Y in multiple directions, southwest to California, then right down the Sierra Spine of California to its big deserts, then also west and north to the Cascades and Olympic Range, and then also down the Continental Divide, down Colorado and New Mexico, right to the border. People were talking about a Y2T, meaning Yukon to Tierra del Fuego, just following the Great Line that forms the spine of both Americas. Most of the Latin American countries involved were already doing things like it, and Ecuador and Costa Rica had been leaders all along. It could happen. So, but what about going east? Meaning east into the eastern half of the United States and the eastern half of Canada? Well, most of Canada is empty, really. Of course they have their wheat belt and the Highway 1 corridor and their big cities, sure. But most of that is near the US border. And Canada is big. Really, they could lead the half-Earth movement without even changing much. Shift 2% of their human population, and over half of their country would be left to the animals. Of course, a lot of the world turns out to be like that. But Canada, wow. The United States, not so much. The farm states have a well-distributed population, and farms occupy every square inch of land that can be cultivated, and they've killed off all the wild animals they can, in particular the top predators. So naturally they have a deer infestation, thus a tick infestation, thus a human plague of Lyme disease, and so on.
Oops.
Ecology in action. And it's true they still have the usual super competent omnivore scavengers, the coyotes and raccoons and possums and such. But other than that, no. The Midwest has been treated like a continent-sized factory floor for assembling grocery store commodities, and anything that got in the way of that was designated a pest or vermin and killed off. Just the way it was. Part of a long-standing culture. It had been the same in California's Central Valley, and it was still in the AG regions of the South. So when you advocated for wild animals in these old-fashioned parts of the country, it was like advocating for locusts or your favorite plant disease, even though they were getting it backwards in terms of source of disease. And living in pools of pesticides that were chewing on their hormones and their DNA in ways sure to kill them. But that was a case that had to be made, and for sure there were headwinds. There were people screaming at you at meetings. There were men with guns foaming at the mouth, sick with the anticipation of shooting and killing some animal, any animal, such that their target might easily shift from wolf to man, if they thought they could get away with it. The situation had to be handled with a touch of delicacy. First, money. Significant applications of money. Then, persuasion. Hedgerows often saved soil. They built soil. They were considered worth the land they took. Native plant strips, the same. No-till AG, the same. Habitat corridors had to be seen first as extensions of that kind of agriculture, done to increase soil building and soil resilience. Wide hedgerows were the wedge for this topic, the least objectionable innovation. Then the idea of wild animals had to be brought in as kind of pest control devices. Of course, those who grazed domestic animals were not pleased, but since the mad cow disease scare in the previous decade, with its subsequent collapse of beef demand, there were simply far fewer domestic beasts out there to worry about. Hogs were enclosed, chickens were enclosed. Those supposedly terrible wolves would now mostly be eating tick-infested crop-eating deer. It was the deer who were the pests, deer who devastated crops. It was a matter of crop protection to have wild predators on the land. And you could even hunt them later on, if some culling was found necessary. Although making this argument was a bit disingenuous, as some of the more hot-headed among my colleagues were all for doing their culling by hunting the hunters. But we who were friendly Midwestern spokesperson types emphasized the pest control aspect of reintroducing wild animals, without going into detail concerning which pests we were talking about. And, to tell the truth, the upper Midwest and the states west of it all the way to Seattle were hurting bad. They were emptying out anyway. People could make more money ranching buffalo and tending wildlife sanctuaries than they could by farming. Those upper plains were never meant to be farmed, and people had learned that the hard way right from the start. Now all the young people were taking off and never coming back. What would make them stay? Wildlife protection. Especially when you could make a good living at it. Better than the debt-ridden, drought-stricken, winter-blasted, poisonous, hardscrabble farming that people had been attempting for the previous 2 centuries. All that effort had gotten them nothing but a dust bowl and mounting debt, and kids moving away, and early death. A category error from the start, and ecological illiteracy. Time for a change. So, we would go to county supervisors and town council meetings and church meetings and state legislature meetings and county fairs and trade shows and school assemblies and every kind of meeting, all the meetings no one ever thinks to go to and deeply regrets going to the moment they do, and we would make our case and show the photos and the figures and see what we could do. Offer them woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers if that's what it took, although to tell the truth, people in the upper Midwest seldom go for that. Their idea of charismatic megafauna is their chocolate lab. It was working pretty well when we ran into a snag. A militia group with a burr up its ass declared that even though we had the right to cross the state border from Montana into North Dakota, leading a herd of buffalo as the vanguard of a suite of animals that included, yes, lions and panthers and bears. Oh my, they were going to stop us. It was their God-given right as Americans to stand their ground and kill trespassers of any kind, animal or human. And some private property owners along the state border were willing to let these guys congregate and block our passage when we crossed the state line. They organized a mob who all drove to these properties in their fat pickup trucks and prepared to meet us with their guns blazing. It was a flashpoint, a media event. Well, fine. Media events can be good. The trick is to handle them right, which of course includes not getting killed. So we could send in a herd of 10,000 buffalo and crush them underfoot, like in that movie. Very satisfying, but not really serving the larger purpose. Not a good hearts and minds kind of move. Or we could walk in front of the animals with our families, put the kids in the vanguard holding their pet ducks and raccoons, and overwhelm them with love and kindness and puppies. Uncertain that and dangerous. A great media image, and yet not a good idea. We ended up going with cowboys, wrangling a herd of wild horses. Also some sheep and sheepdogs, as if to reconcile the old Western fight between those 2 competing ways of wrecking the land. And these were wild horses and wild sheep and wild mountain goats. The sheepdogs were domestic, of course. They were just there to get dogs involved. Not that they aren't great at sheep herding, because they are. But they were useful for more than that. They were the Midwest's emotional support animals, their link between man and beast. Then, behind that vanguard of cowboys and sheepdogs, the whole parade. Buffalo, elk, moose, bears. It was like an old-fashioned circus come to town. We kind of wished we did have a woolly mammoth or 2. And we lowballed the wolves and the mountain lions. They didn't like to keep company with us anyway, and they could sneak in later at night, in their usual way. It wasn't natural to even see a mountain lion. They like to lie low and are extremely nocturnal. In my whole life I've only seen one once in the wild, and in truth it was terrifying. I thought I was done for. So the day came, and we alerted the press, and people showed up from all over the world. So many people wanted to march with us that there were more people than animals, and the animals were getting spooked, naturally. But we started up anyway, right after dawn, and hit the state line across a 10-mile front, like a World War I over-the-top assault. And it did look kind of over the top. Those poor animal murderers never had a chance. Actually, quite a few of them stood their ground and shot a bunch of animals. Mostly deer, it turned out, as we had sent them out as scouts. Poor guys. The first wave. Deer are the sad sacks of American wildlife. So beautiful, so defenseless, so numerous, so dim. Their chief predator is cars. They never seem to get it about cars or anything else. Or maybe they do, but they don't have a good way to transmit what they learn to their kids, if they happen to get lucky and live past their youth. It's important always to remember that even if they're as common as rats, some kind of mammal weed, they are still beautiful wild animals, getting by on their own in a dangerous world. I always say hi when I see them, and try to remember to get the same thrill I would if I were to see someone unusual, like a wolverine. It's hard, but it's a habit you can build. Love your deer. Just fence your veggie garden really well. So, the day went about as well as we hoped. A few deer were killed, a few animal murderers and all-round jerks were embarrassed by the lame ways they had to stand down or slip away and pretend it had never happened. We even got good film of pickup trucks driving away at speed. Also of a duck hunter's blind demolished in a charge of buffalo who didn't even notice they had run something over. Cowboys did figure eights and stood in their saddles and twirled their lassos. Sheepdogs nimbly nipped sheep through gates, and the images and stories went out worldwide. It was just one moment of the storm, but after that, habitat corridors were more of a thing. E.O. Wilson's great book shot to the top of the nonfiction bestseller lists, and we could continue the work with more understanding and public support. On to the Half-Earth. Chapter 73. Modern monetary theory was in some ways a reintroduction of Keynesian economics into the climate crisis. Its foundational axiom was that the economy works for humans, not humans for the economy. This implied that full employment should be the policy goal of the governments that made and enforced the economic laws. So a job guarantee, JG, was central to MMT's ideas of good governance. Anyone who wanted a job could get one from the government, the employer of last resort, and all these public workers were to be paid a living wage, which would have the effect of raising the private wage floor also to that level, in order to remain competitive for workers. MMT also reiterated Keynes's point that governments did not experience debt like individuals did, because governments made money in the first place and could create new money without automatically causing inflation. The quantitative easing, QE, after the 2008 crash demonstrated this price stability despite major infusions of new money. So, MMT recommended robust stimulus spending in the form of carbon quantitative easing, CQE, as well as a job guarantee. Both were to be directed to the effort to decarbonize civilization and to get in a sustainable balance with the biosphere, humanity's one and only support system. Critics of MMT, who sometimes called it magic money tree, pointed out that Keynes had advocated deficit spending during economic contractions, but also the reverse in times of expansion, governments gathering in enough in taxes to fund things through the next crisis. To ignore this countercyclical necessity and regard money as infinitely expandable was a mistake, these critics said, because there was a real relationship between price and value, no matter how distorted that got by various historical forces. Also, if governments offered full employment, then they were in effect setting the wage floor, and if that caused inflation and governments then stemmed that inflation with price controls, then government would be in effect setting both wages and prices, thus taking complete control of the economy. And at that point they might as well dispense with money entirely and go to the red plenty solution of computer-assisted production of everything needed. In other words, to communism. Why not just admit that and go there? There were some who responded to that question with, yes, why not? The MMT advocates replied that they hoped to retain what was empirically useful in conventional economics as a social science for purposes of policy analysis, while reorienting economics' ultimate goals to human and biosphere welfare, thereby changing its policy perspectives and monetary theories, leading to recommendations for actions that would help get civilization through the narrowing gate of their crisis. Economics was a tool for optimizing actions to reach goals. The goals could be adjusted and should be. So the MMT crowd admitted they were proposing a move to a new political economy, rather than merely adjusting capitalism. It was not just Keynes plus, nor just the ad hoc theory or rather praxis that had gotten them through the 2020 crash, nor just the theory or praxis that had bolstered and ultimately paid for the Green New Deal, that early shot in the war for the Earth. It was more than that. It was trying to think through how to do the needful in the biosphere's time of crisis, while orthodox economics failed to rise to the occasion and stayed focused in its old analysis of capitalism, as if capitalism were the only possible political economy, thus freezing economics as a discipline like a deer in the headlights of an onrushing car. Enough governments were convinced by MMT to try it. That it influenced so much policy through the late 30s was regarded as a sign either of progress or of desperate fantasy solutions. Similarly split responses had of course greeted Keynesian policies exactly a century before, so for some observers the interesting thing became to watch the next steps and see whether this time around, having reiterated in this realm the 20th century's 30s, they would manage to avoid reiterating its 40s. Chapter 74. Days passed for Frank one like the next. He didn't mark a calendar or keep track of the day of the week. Every once in a while Serene and her younger girl would come by to visit, seemed like once a month or so. He got the impression the older girl was too mad at him to come. Mary Murphy came by more like every week or two. She worked nearby, he thought. The meals in the prison dining hall were solid Swiss food. He was gaining a little weight on it. He read over his bowl or plate, books from the library. Occasionally an English-language newspaper, published weekly in Paris. The prison library had a lot of books in English, and he made his way through them unmethodically. John le Carré, George Eliot, Dickens, Joyce Carey, Simenon, Daniel Defoe. Robinson Crusoe was funny. Lucky to have been able to ransack the wreck of his ship like that. All that stuff he saved had given him a good life. Not unlike Frank's in some ways. He too was stranded on an island getting by. Most days he got on the 8 a.m. van that ran prisoners around the city. He kept getting off at the refugee camps. This was always a little disturbing, but he did it anyway. Maybe it was what one of the therapists had called habituation. Go right at what bothers you. Face up to it. One of the books in the prison library had been written by an African man who had traveled up the coast of Greenland in the early 20th century, staying in Inuit villages. Eskimos, he called them. He wrote that they had a saying in their cold little villages to deal with the times when fishermen went out and never came back, or when children died. Hunger, disease, drowning, freezing, death by polar bear, and so on. They had a lot of traumas. Nevertheless, the Eskimos were cheerful, the man wrote. Their storm god was called Nartsuk. So their saying was, you have to face up to Nartsuk. This meant staying cheerful despite all. No matter how bad things got, the Inuit felt it was inappropriate to be sad or express grief. They laughed at misfortunes, made jokes about things that went wrong. They were facing up to Nartsuk, which they all had to do. One day, working a camp food line and seeing a distraught refugee's face out of the corner of his eye, he understood that eventually everyone was post-traumatic, or even still mid-trauma. These people he served had been variously beaten, shot at, bombed, driven out of their homes, seen people killed. All had made desperate journeys to get here, sleeping on the ground, hungry. Now they were in a new place where possibly new things could happen, different things, good things. It was a matter of being patient, of focusing on the people right in front of your face. Possibly they could get past their traumas. Eventually, you had to talk to people. Frank seldom talked to anyone, but sometimes he did, and then he found himself babbling a little. But asking questions too, and listening to what people said to him. No matter how bad their English was, it was always better than his attempts at their language. They used English like a hammer to get their meaning across. They banged in nails of meaning. Strangely articulate and expressive sentences often emerged from them. Sometimes they sounded like Defoe's characters. The situation has become urgently urgent, someone said to him one day. I blew the sky. One little girl exclaimed. The news often disturbed him. Heat waves, terrorist attacks. All the militaries of the world were focused on counterterrorism. There weren't any state-on-state clashes serious enough to distract the militaries from trying to discover and root out terrorists. But with limited success, it seemed. A hydra-headed foe, someone called it. And to Frank it seemed different than it had when he was a child, when terrorists were universally abhorred. Now it felt different. Many attacks now were on carbon burners, especially those rich enough to burn it conspicuously. Car races and private jets. Yachts and container ships. So now the terrorists involved were perhaps saboteurs, or even resistance warriors, fighting for the Earth itself. Gaia's shock troops, children of Kali, defenders of Mother Earth, Earth First, and so on. People read about their violent acts and the frequent resulting deaths and shrugged. What did people expect? Who owned private jets anymore? There were blimps now that flew carbon negative, as the solar panels on their top sides collected more electricity than needed for the flight, so that they could microwave it down to receivers they passed over. Air travel could now also be power generation, so, a jet?
No.
If a few people got killed for flying, no one felt much sympathy. Fools conspicuously burning carbon, killed from out of the sky somehow? So what? Death from the sky had been the American way ever since Clinton and Bush and Obama, which was to say ever since it became technologically feasible. People were angry, people were scared. People were not fastidious. The world was trembling on the brink, something had to be done. The state monopoly on violence had probably been a good idea while it lasted, but no one could believe it would ever come back. Only in some better time. Meanwhile, hunker down. Try to stay lucky. Don't fly on private jets, or maybe any kind of jet. It was like eating beef. Some things were just too dangerous to continue doing. When your veggie burger tasted just as good, while your beef package proclaimed guaranteed safe. With a liability waiver in small print at the bottom, you knew a different time had come. One afternoon after he returned from the big camp in Winterthur, Mary Murphy came by. They crossed the street and sat down at a table in a cafe. Nice afternoon, still in the sun. Coffee furtig, its attractive little clash of bitternesses, clash of effects. This strange woman watching him. Life in prison not so bad. Indeed, at the next table another pair of prisoners were sharing a spliff. The prison wardens approved of prisoners using cannabis. It kept them calmer. Wardens looked the other way even when it was smoked in the prison's smoking yard, much less across the street. They were right about the calming effect, so it was just being sensible. And the Swiss were all about being sensible. Frank said to Mary, "These attacks on carbon burners. There's a lot of them now." Yes. She looked at her glass. "Do you think some of them are done by your people?" he asked.
No.
"We don't do that kind of thing." She was never going to admit anything to him. She had no reason to. They had once or twice passed through certain elusive moments of closeness, starting even that very first night in her apartment, but now they seemed to have drifted apart and come to rest in something more distant, more formal. He didn't know why she visited him anymore. "Why do you visit me?" he asked. "I like to see how you're doing." She paused, sipped her drink. "Also, I like knowing where you are." "Ah, yeah. You seem calmer, but what? Not quite here. Not happy." He blew out a breath, a poof of dismissal. "I'm not. It's been a long time," she said. "Since when?" "Since the bad things happened." He shrugged. "They're still happening." She seemed to lose patience. "You can't take on the whole world's troubles. No one should try to do that. It happens without trying. Maybe you should stop reading the news. Stop watching the screens." "I'm reading Moll Flanders." It was the same for her. Who's she again? A character in Defoe. Sister to Robinson Crusoe. Oh yeah, I sort of remember. She smiled briefly. A survivor. For sure. They didn't worry like we do. They faced up to Nartsuck. There was no such thing as post-traumatic stress disorder. Or else it was everywhere. Just the water they swam in. That's still a difference. Maybe. But Moll Flanders didn't try to take on the whole world's trauma, as I recall. People weren't so worried about other people. But we should be, right? For them, people dropped dead all the time. You had to move on. Could be your partner, your kid. Now it feels different. You and yours probably won't drop dead, not today. Mine did, Mary said shortly. That startled him, and he looked at her more closely. She watched her drink. He recalled a moment that first night when he had asked her about her life, how she had flared up at him. Angrier at a personal question than being kidnapped, almost. Okay, he said, but still somehow it's different. Maybe what we know now. We know we all live in a village of 8 billion neighbors. That's our now. It's all of us succeed, or none of us is safe. So we take an interest in how the others are doing. If that's all true. Isn't it? I think a lot of people don't do the global village part. Janice Athena says village is the wrong idea. And nationalism has come back big time. Your language is your family. Pull in the perimeter like that, and it gets easier. You still get to have your us and them. But it's wrong. Maybe. He felt a little jolt of irritation. Of course it's wrong. Why do you say that? Are you trying to tweak me? Maybe. He glared at her. She relented a bit. What is it they say about us only really knowing a few score people? Like back in the Ice Ages. It's different now, he insisted.
We know more now.
Those people in the caves, they only knew there were a few hundred people alive. Now we know better and we feel it. She nodded. I suppose it could be. 8 billion people. All stuffed in here.
She tapped her chest.
No wonder it feels so crowded. All smashed into one big mass. The everything feeling. Frank nodded, trying that on. That feeling of pressure in his chest. The headaches. Call it the everything feeling. A new feeling, or a new blend of feelings, bitter and dark. Caffeine and alcohol. Uppers and downers. Lots of everything. The everything feeling made sense that it resembled being somewhat stunned. Not unlike despair. Maybe, he said, mimicking her. She grimaced, acknowledging that she had been annoying. Oceans of clouds in my chest. Some poet said that. So, say we feel the global village, but in a mixed-up way. Is that what you're saying you are, mixed up? Mashed together?
No.
Yes. He glanced at her, looked down again. Maybe. She was regarding him with a very curious look. You should go up to the Alps, have a walk around. I found it very clarifying, even though I was up there for bad reasons. It could be a day trip from here, you could be home by curfew. Maybe. Later he considered what she had said. That he was not all there, true. That he was mashed together into a thing he couldn't grasp. True. The everything feeling. But the project was to face up to Nartsuk. That wasn't just acceptance, but defiance. You had to laugh at whatever the world threw at you. That was good Inuit style. He took the train to Luzerne, a bus to the forest under Pilatus. Hiked up one of the trails through a strange park-like forest, then up onto the big, clean, grassy Alp above the forest, and below the gray peak. Cable car high above, swinging up and down across a giant gap of air. He ignored it and contoured around the peak until he couldn't see it anymore. He only had a couple hours before he would have to head back, so it was kind of an exercise in getting as high as possible on this trail and then turning back. Still mid-Alp, crossing a tilted, rumpled lawn of immense size, he came over a small vertical ridge in the trail, and there was an animal standing there. 4 of them. Chamois or ibex, he didn't know. He was just guessing. He had heard they were up here. This group was maybe a male and female and 2 youngsters, but not too young. He couldn't really tell. They didn't seem disturbed by his presence. They were aware of him, alert, heads up, sniffing, but they were chewing their cuds, it looked like. Slow and regular chewing, a lump inside their cheeks had to be a cud being chewed, or so it seemed. Their bodies were rounded and full. They looked well-fed. If they ate grass, he could see why that would be so. Their heads looked like goats' heads. They had short horns, slightly curved back but mainly straight. Horizontal ridges ringed the horns, possibly annual growth. Looked like that made for strong horns, could really stick you if they tilted their head down. Although they'd have to be looking back between their forelegs to have their horns pointing forward, so that was a mystery. Short brown hair over most of their bodies, but finer beige hair, like fur, on their bellies, with a dark band separating brown from beige. The biggest one was looking at him. Then Frank saw it. The creature's irises were rectangular. Like a goat, then? It gave him a little shock to see it. Rectangular irises. How could that be?
Why?
Was it really looking at him?
Seemed like it was.
Steady regard of another animal, chewing as it watched him. What would this person do? Was he a problem? The creature did not seem to think so. It was more a case of interest. Frank, standing there in his windbreaker. They looked at each other. Frank mimed chewing a cud of his own. The creature tilted its head to the side, interested at this, perhaps. It blinked from time to time. A gust of wind ruffled the hair on its back, then Frank's beard. Frank smiled to feel it. Something reminded him to look at his watch. It was late. Apparently, he had been locked in a gaze with this chamois, or ibex, or mountain goat, this person of the Alps, for around 20 minutes. It had felt like 2 or 3. He stirred, raised his hand uncertainly, waved weakly at the beast, turned and headed back. Chapter 75. In the United States, the National Students Union website showed that 30% of the union members had now responded yes to the union website's standing poll asking them if they were in so much financial distress caused by their student debt that they would like to see the union initiate a fiscal noncompliance strike by not paying their next debt payment. On joining the union, members had agreed to join any strike requested by 30% of the membership. So now the union coordinators called for a strike vote to be sure, and got an 80% yes vote, with 90% participation. None of this was surprising. Student food insecurity, meaning student hunger, was widespread, also student homelessness. So the strike began. Student debt was $1 trillion annual income stream for the banks, so this coordinated default meant that the banks were suddenly in cash flow hell. And they were so overleveraged and thus dependent on all incoming payments being made to them on time to be able to keep paying their own debts, that this fiscal strike threw them immediately into a liquidity crisis reminiscent of the 2008 and 2020 and 2034 crashes, except this time people had defaulted on purpose, and precisely to bring the banks down. The banks all rushed to the Federal Reserve, which went to Congress to explain the situation and ask for another giant bailout to keep liquidity and thus confidence in the financial system itself. There were calls from many in Congress to bail out the banks, as being essential to the economy and too connected for any of the big ones to be allowed to fail. But this time the Fed asked Congress to authorize their bailing out the banks in exchange for ownership shares in every bank that took the offer. This was either nationalizing finance or financializing the nation, in that now it was clearer than ever that the country was in effect run by the federal. And since Congress ran the Fed and people voted in members of Congress, maybe it was all beginning to work, somehow, because of this strike. Definancialization, of a sort. End of neoliberalism. This possibility was shocking enough, but in that same month, the African Union informed the World Bank and the Chinese government that they were declaring all African debts to these organizations to be odious debts. All the national governments forming the African Union were together backing complete debt forgiveness, the haircut of haircuts, to be followed by a new set of agreements negotiated by the African Union in collaboration with all the African nation-states. They called this the end of neoliberal neocolonialism and the definitive start of Africa for Africans. Even Egypt and the rest of North Africa joined in on this, plumping for people over capital, continent over history, and in Egypt's case, maybe all the Muslim North, splitting with Arabia. And in the very next month, in China the workers known informally as the billion took over Tiananmen Square by the simple expedient of walking into it by the millions, on the way causing all the rest of the traffic in the city to grind to a halt. By taking over Beijing's highways by way of a crush of pedestrians, they were able to bypass the barriers and checkpoints around Tiananmen Square and fill it and the surrounding district so full that the police and army couldn't react, confronted as they were by about 5 million people jammed into the city center. Similar demonstrations appeared in all the largest Chinese cities. There were literally hundreds of such demonstrations, far more than the Chinese army could deal with in any typical crowd control way. Coordinated demands for the end to the hookah system were supplemented by other demands that together insisted that the Chinese Communist Party be more responsive to all its citizens' needs. As the protests had been timed to the 5-year Party Congress meeting, it proved possible to pressure the party into appointing an entirely new standing committee, one including women and younger people, and devoted to reforms as demanded. Seeing an opportunity in all this turmoil, the Kurds declared Kurdistan in the part of Iraq they already controlled, with significant chunks of Syria, Turkey, and Iran included within the new boundary, to underline the point that the Kurds were asserting themselves here, and there was no one strong enough to stop them. All the surrounding countries were outraged and antagonistic, but they were also already antagonistic among themselves, so they could not form an effective response that would not also constitute an attack on a neighboring sovereign state, either ally or enemy, but either way a nation dangerous to attack. All these events occurred at once. And these were not all. There was so much going on, such a spasm of revolts occurring spontaneously, if it was spontaneous, all over the world, that some historians said it was another 1848, some kind of re-emergence of the spirit of 1848 around the zone of its bicentennial. And just as it had been during that period of enormous unrest and revolutionary upheaval, no one could explain why it was happening in so many different places at the same time. Coincidence? Conspiracy? World spirit? Zeitgeist in action? Who knew? All they knew for sure was that it was happening. Things were falling apart. In all this turmoil and uncertainty, the market sought something to be sure of. Volatility was good for traders, sure. But at the end of the day, you had to have somewhere to hang your hat. Short the dollar, really? Short everything? Maybe, but where then did you hide your emergency fund in case everything went pear-shaped? The cash in the mattress move wasn't the same as going long, which actually at this point was looking almost impossible. This meant things were getting more and more existential, as it was a question of ultimate value, of trust in the act of exchange itself. And when definitions of value shifted from talking about interest rates to talking about social trust, when finance and theories of money fell through a trapdoor in daily normality, down into the free fall of philosophy's bottomless pit, when people began to wonder why money worked at all, wonder why some people were as gods walking this earth while other people couldn't find a place to lay their head at night. It turned out there was no very good answer. Certainly no answer at all when it came to investment strategies you could count on. Money was made of social trust, which meant, in this spasmophilic moment, with everything changing and the ground falling under one's feet in immense tectonic jolts, that money itself was therefore in limbo. And that was scary. Vast amounts of paper turned to vapor. The banks of the developed Western world were too connected to fail. If one or two of the big ones went down, the rest would shrink in on themselves and wait for the state to re-establish trust before either lending money or even paying what they owed. Why pay a creditor that might be non-existent next week? Best wait and see if they survive to press that debt in court. In other words, liquidity freeze. The various forms of paper that are in effect IOUs between banks all became worthless. The only money was cash. But that couldn't work, because every day there were trillions of dollars worth of exchanges on the various markets, including the dark pools where people working in unregulated data space were trusting each other to pay despite the lack of regulatory oversight. And honor among thieves is kind of a feudal notion, more appropriate to Robin Hood and his merry men than to the world of contemporary finance.
No.
Since money is an idea, a system based on social trust, when things go south and trust disappears in a poof, then there simply isn't as much money as there used to be. This was not shocking news to some, which was why much of the wealth on the planet was invested in property. Real estate values may drop, but ownership of that capital asset still remains, and will be there later no matter what happens. But property is not liquid. So the money problem remains even if the latent wealth problem has been solved in advance by buying up land, houses, apartments in Manhattan towers, and so on. So with groans and clanks and huge ripping sounds, the world's economy ground to a halt. A Great Depression was back at last and in full after almost a decade of recession. The depression they had been living in up until now got called the Little Depression or the Super Stagnation and so on. This new one was the Super Depression here at last. Very little money out there, and without money, people can't be paid. No loans, no purchases. Unemployment quickly surpassed the 1930s high-water mark of 25%. Indeed, this time it looked like unemployment could rise to what? 50%? 70%? No one had any idea. People spoke of barter coming back, especially in rural areas, where one could almost believe in it. But not really. Barter was always mostly an idea in the minds of economists, a fantasy history. And in the cities it didn't work at all. The pawn shop is the bartering site in cities. But that's just money for stuff, stuff for money. It only works if money works. Same with the internet, only more so. The internet as a market didn't work when no one trusted money. Local currencies were proposed and introduced, backed by the town one lived in. But the town needed local banks, and the local banks needed central banks. A lively set of exchanges nevertheless began in many local regions, often watersheds big enough to support their populations, and people began to use their Yorlock accounts as sites for digital microbanking that was of some real use, and showed potential for some kind of post-capitalist crowd banking. But all this was too new, too provisional. There were too many people, and all of them strangers. Despite all the interesting efforts, as the economy circled the drain, it became clearer. For this moment, it was the central banks or nothing. They were the Dutch boy's finger plugging the leak, the last stitch that might stop the hemorrhaging. The central banks spoke for the state. The states in question were there with their armies and police to back these central banks, all of them in theory owned by the public they reported to. If public banks held the line somehow, perhaps by creating more money, by keeping all the private banks afloat, by way of even more quantitative easing, then all might be well. Since some people had been pinning their hopes on the central banks anyway, this sudden onset of chaos and disorder was seen as an opportunity. Possibly the public could now insist on the right to be properly repaid for public money backing private banks, as they had been all along. Extract reparations from the profit takers, abolish profit if it was necessary to create the reparations. If the private banks objected, let them crash, then move to a fully nationalized financial system, owned by the public and used for the benefit of the people. So, strangely, in this new utmost financial crisis, people, ordinary people en masse, as the material manifestation of the public, now seem to hold the ultimate power. When push comes to shove, it's always humans looking at humans, and when 1,000 people stand looking at one person, it's clear who has more power. So it was a matter of realizing that, then acting on that realization. Maybe that shouldn't have felt strange, but it did. It felt like free fall. Inventing the parachute after leaping off the cliff, which meant it had to be arranged fast. Thus the shadow government devised by the Ministry for the Future in Zurich, Switzerland, became one template for a new plan. Not completely new, of course. In fact, it was a rearrangement of various elements of old plans, in many ways. Mondragon, Kerala, MMT, blockchain, Denmark, Cuba, and so on, all the elements had been out there working all along, which made the new methods easier to implement. Not complete revolution, no 10-day weeks with new names and so on, no dive into that revolutionary euphoria that tries to change everything at once. Just ownership adjustments. Numbers. Representations. Reversals in some valences of value. Improvisations. The sun still rose, plants kept growing. But people lived in ideas, so despite the sun in the sky and so on, things felt crazy. It was a panic spring. But as it became clear that the central banks were stepping in to keep things stable and liquid, certain markets calmed. Bakeries kept baking. The U.S. Congress got very busy adopting new laws. Chinese people ended their demonstrations and went back to work, with a different standing committee in charge. Kurdistan secured its borders and signed treaties with every nation and organization that would co-sign. People began to look for ways to earn a carbon coin or two. Only a few of these would be a lot in the local currencies. Surely sequestering 100 tons of carbon couldn't be so hard. DIY DAC became a vibrant side activity, like growing a truck garden for food, and sometimes the two were even the same thing. It was quite a month, then quite a year that became one of those years that people talk about later, a date used as shorthand for a whole period. A tectonic shift in history, an earthquake in the head.